In the soft glow of candlelight, 500 years ago, a man sat alone in his studio, sketching wings that had never flown, machines that had never moved, and dreams that had never been dreamed before. His hands were stained with paint and ink, his mind alive with questions no one else dared to ask. He was not a king, not a conqueror, not a saint. He was simply a man who saw the world differently, who looked at a bird and saw the secret of flight, who studied a smile and found infinity. His name was Leonardo, and though he lived in a time of stone and candlelight, his mind belonged to the future. Tonight, as the world grows quiet and the stars begin their ancient watch, let us walk beside him through the winding streets of Renaissance Italy, through the gardens of genius, through the shadows of doubt and the light of discovery. Let his story carry you gently into sleep, like a lullaby whispered across the centuries. If these words carry you closer to sleep, let this channel stay by your side too. Rest your thoughts here and let history cradle you softly through the night. Subscribe and drift with us into the dreams of those who changed the world. Chapter 1. The Boy Born in the Hills. The hills of Tuscany have always known how to keep secrets. They rise and fall like the breath of something ancient, dressed in silver-green olive groves and vineyards that glow gold beneath the Italian sun. In spring, wildflowers scatter across the slopes like paint thrown by an invisible hand, and the air hums with the songs of insects and birds who have claimed this land as their own. It is a place where time moves differently, where the stone farmhouses seem to have grown from the earth itself, and where the wind carries stories from centuries past. It was here, in this gentle wilderness, that Leonardo da Vinci was born, not in a palace, not in a city of marble and ambition, but in a simple house on a hillside, surrounded by the quiet symphony of nature. The date was April 15th, 1452. The world outside Tuscany was stirring with change. The Ottoman Empire was tightening its grip on the East. The printing press was only a dream in a German goldsmith's mind. And the Renaissance, that great flowering of human thought and beauty, was just beginning to unfold across Italy like a slow, magnificent dawn. But in the village of Vinci, nestled in the hills above Florence, life was simpler, quieter, governed by the rhythm of seasons and the cycle of harvest. Here, a child entered the world whose mind would one day reshape everything humanity thought it knew about art, science, and the very nature of possibility. His mother was Caterina, a young peasant woman whose history has been largely lost to time. Some say she was an orphan. Others whisper she may have been from the East, perhaps even enslaved, though the records are too faint to confirm. What we know for certain is that she was unmarried, and in the rigid social order of 5th-10th century Italy, this marked her son from the moment of his first breath. His father, Ser Piero da Vinci, was a notary, a man of some education and standing, tasked with drawing up contracts and legal documents for the merchants and landowners of the region. Ser Piero acknowledged the child as his own, but he did not marry Caterina. Within months of Leonardo's birth, he wed another woman, one deemed more suitable by the standards of the time, and Caterina faded from the record, married off to a local craftsman. Her role in history reduced to a single shining moment, the birth of a genius. Leonardo was raised in his father's household, but he existed in a peculiar in-between space. He was not a bastard cast out into poverty, but neither was he fully legitimate. He bore his father's name, lived under his roof, yet the doors that would have opened for a legitimate son remained firmly closed. He could not inherit his father's profession. He could not attend university. The guilds and institutions that governed Renaissance society looked at him and saw only the circumstances of his birth, the stain of illegitimacy that no amount of talent could wash away. And so, while other boys of means were taught Latin and mathematics and the formal structures of knowledge, Leonardo was left to wander the hills, to teach himself, to learn from the world rather than from books. And what a classroom those hills became. He walked alone through the forests, watching the way light filtered through the leaves, how it turned the air itself into something visible, something golden. He knelt beside streams and studied the water as it flowed over stones, the way it eddied and swirled, forming patterns that repeated no matter how many times he watched. He caught insects and examined them with a curiosity that bordered on reverence, marveling at the delicate architecture of a dragonfly's wing, the perfect mathematics of a spider's web. He climbed trees and sat in their branches for hours, observing birds as they took flight, trying to understand the mechanics of their wings, the angle of their bodies, the invisible forces that lifted them into the sky. Other children played games of war and commerce, mimicking the world of their fathers. Leonardo played games of observation. He was quiet, thoughtful, often mistaken for shy, but his silence was not emptiness, it was fullness. His mind was always working, always questioning, always trying to see beneath the surface of things. Why did shadows have color? How did muscles move beneath skin? What made one face beautiful and another plain? These were not the questions of a child. They were the questions of a scientist, an artist, a philosopher, all rolled into one small boy who did not yet know what he was becoming. His grandfather, Antonio, seems to have recognized something special in the boy. He did not learn about nature from books written by ancient authorities. He learned about nature from nature itself. He wandered the hillsides in all seasons, in all weather. He watched storms gather over the mountains, saw lightning split the sky, and counted the seconds until thunder rolled across the valley. He witnessed the violence of spring floods, the way water could transform from a gentle stream into a roaring force that tore at the earth and reshaped the landscape. He saw death too, the hawk that struck the dove in midair, the lamb taken by wolves, the slow decay of a fallen tree returning to soil. These things were not morbid to him. They were simply true, part of the great cycle that governed all living things, and he observed them with the same calm attention he gave to everything else. In the quiet moments, when the wind stilled and the world seemed to hold its breath, Leonardo would sit on a sun-warmed stone and draw. He had no fine parchment, no expensive inks. He sketched with whatever he could find, a stick in the dirt, charcoal on a flat rock, chalk on a scrap of rough paper. His subjects were humble, a twisted olive branch, a lizard basking in the sun, the profile of an old farmer passing on the road. But even in these early, clumsy drawings, there was something present that went beyond mere copying. Leonardo was not just recording what he saw. He was trying to understand it, to capture not only the shape of a thing but its essence, its inner life. He was fascinated by movement, by the way things changed from moment to moment. A bird in flight was not a single image, but a sequence, a transformation from stillness to motion. And he tried to capture that transformation on paper, drawing the same wing in multiple positions, studying the mechanics of feathers and air. He watched his own hand as he moved it through space, flexing his fingers, rotating his wrist, marveling at the complexity hidden beneath the skin, the tendons pulling, the joints articulating, the bones providing structure. Even then, Without the vocabulary to name what he was doing, Leonardo was thinking like an anatomist, an engineer, a scientist wrapped in the skin of a child. The people of Vinci must have thought him strange. He was too quiet, too watchful, too absorbed in things that had no practical value. What use was there in staring at a butterfly for an hour? What profit in sketching the way water rippled around a stone? The world demanded useful labor, plowing fields, tending vines, hammering iron, stitching leather. But Leonardo existed somewhere outside that world, in a private universe where everything mattered, where every detail was a clue to some larger mystery he could not yet name. His father, Sir Piero, was a practical man, and he must have looked at his peculiar son with a mixture of pride and bewilderment. The boy was clearly intelligent, but his intelligence ran in channels that had no clear destination. And yet, even Sir Piero could not ignore the evidence of Leonardo's gift. The boy drew constantly, compulsively, and as the years passed, his drawings became undeniable. There was a precision to them, a lifelikeness that seemed almost uncanny. When Leonardo sketched a face, it was not a generic face but a specific person, captured with all their unique features, their individual soul somehow present in the lines. When he drew an animal, you could almost see it breathe, almost hear it move. This was not a hobby. This was not a pastime. This was something else entirely, a talent so pronounced that even a practical notary could not ignore it. So Sir Piero made a decision that would change the course of history. He gathered some of Leonardo's drawings, the best ones, the most striking, and brought them to Florence, to the workshop of Andrea del Verrocchio, one of the most respected artists in the city. Verrocchio was a man who had seen everything, who had trained dozens of apprentices, who could spot talent with a single glance. And when he looked at the drawings of this illegitimate boy from the hills, something in his expression shifted. He studied them in silence, holding them up to the light, tracing the lines with his eyes, and then he looked at Sir Piero and said simply, "Send him to me." Leonardo was 14 years old when he left the hills of Vinci behind. It was 1466, and Florence was the beating heart of the Renaissance, a city where art and commerce and power collided in brilliant, chaotic splendor. The boy, who had grown up among olive trees and quiet streams, was about to step into a world of marble dust and ambition, of competition and beauty and endless, dazzling possibility. He did not know, as he walked down from the hills toward the city gates, that he was leaving childhood behind forever. He did not know that the world he was entering would never quite be able to contain him, that his mind would outgrow every boundary it tried to place around him. But perhaps, in some quiet corner of his awareness, he sensed it. Perhaps he felt the weight of the moment, the turning of some invisible wheel. The hills had made him who he was, taught him to see, to question, to wonder. And now it was time to take that wild, unstructured genius and see what it could become when shaped by human hands. When tested against the greatest minds of the age, when finally given the tools and the permission to create. The journey from Vinci to Florence was not long in distance, perhaps 30 miles as the crow flies, but it was infinite in meaning. With each step closer to the city, Leonardo was crossing from one world into another, from the organic rhythms of nature into the constructed rhythms of civilization, from the freedom of solitary wandering into the disciplined hierarchy of the workshop. He traveled on foot, most likely, or perhaps on the back of a mule, his few possessions bundled beside him, his drawings carefully wrapped to protect them from the dust of the road. The landscape gradually changed as he descended from the hills. The wild olive groves gave way to cultivated fields, the narrow dirt paths widened into proper roads, and eventually, rising before him like a vision from a dream, Florence appeared. Even from a distance, the city announced itself with confidence. The great dome of the cathedral, Brunelleschi's impossible masterpiece, dominated the skyline, a declaration in brick and stone that humanity could achieve anything it dared to imagine. Around it clustered hundreds of buildings, their red-tiled roofs packed together like scales on some enormous sleeping creature. Church towers punctured the sky at intervals, and the sound of bells carried across the countryside, marking the hours with bronze voices that had rung for generations. As Leonardo drew closer, he would have seen the walls that encircled the city, the gates where guards checked travelers and merchants, the bridges spanning the Arno River like ancient spines connecting one half of Florence to the other. And then he was inside, swallowed whole by the noise and energy of urban life. Florence in 1466 was a city of approximately 50,000 souls, and every one of them seemed to be in motion. Merchants shouted prices from their stalls. Blacksmiths hammered iron into shapes both practical and beautiful. The air smelled of bread baking, of horses and leather, of river water and stone dust, of spices imported from distant lands. Wealthy men in fine robes brushed past beggars holding out empty hands. Priests moved through the crowds like black-robed crows. And everywhere, there was art. It spilled from every corner of the city. Statues stood in public squares, their marble surfaces polished until they seemed almost alive. Frescoes covered the walls of churches and civic buildings, depicting saints and angels and scenes from Scripture with a realism that would have been unthinkable a century before. Bronze doors, carved with such intricate detail that each panel told a complete story, guarded the entrance to the baptistry. Florence was not just a city. It was a living gallery, a place where beauty was both industry and religion, where artists competed for commissions with the same fierce determination that soldiers brought to battle. And at the center of this artistic universe were the workshops, the bottega, where masters trained their apprentices in the mysteries of creation. These were not schools in any formal sense. They were businesses, enterprises that produced art on commission for wealthy patrons, for the church, for the city itself. A successful workshop might employ dozens of people, master artists, journeymen, apprentices of varying skill levels, assistants who ground pigments or prepared panels or mixed plaster. Each workshop had its own character, its own specialty, its own reputation. Some were known for sculpture, others for painting, still others for metalwork or architectural design. And among all the workshops in Florence, one of the most prestigious belonged to Andrea del Verrocchio. Verrocchio's bottega was located in the heart of the city, not far from the Palazzo Vecchio and the bustling energy of the Piazza della Signoria. When Leonardo first stepped through its doors, he entered a space that must have seemed both wondrous and overwhelming. The workshop was large, divided into different areas for different tasks. In one corner, apprentices ground minerals into pigments, lapis lazuli into ultramarine blue, malachite into green, red ochre into earth tones. The air was thick with dust and the sharp smell of turpentine. In another area, sculptors worked clay and chipped away at marble, their mallets striking chisels with rhythmic precision. Paintings in various stages of completion stood on easels or leaned against walls, their surfaces catching the light that streamed through high windows. And presiding over it all was Verrocchio himself, Andrea de Michele de Francesco de Cioni, known to the world by his nickname, which meant True Eye. He was in his early 30s, at the height of his powers, a man who had mastered multiple disciplines and could turn his hand to anything from massive bronze sculptures to delicate goldwork. He was demanding, exacting, but also generous with those who showed promise. He believed in teaching through doing, in letting apprentices learn by actually working on real commissions rather than simply copying drawings or practicing techniques in isolation. This was the man who would shape Leonardo's formal education, who would take the raw, untutored genius from the hills and teach him the language of art. But Leonardo was not Verrocchio's only student. The workshop was filled with young men, all learning the trade, all hoping to make names for themselves. There was Pietro Perugino, who would go on to become one of the most successful painters of his generation. There was Lorenzo di Credi, steady and reliable, who would eventually take over the workshop when Verrocchio died. And there were others whose names have been lost to history, talented boys who learned the craft but never quite broke through into greatness. Into this competitive environment, Leonardo arrived with his bundle of drawings and his strange, quiet intensity, and from the very beginning, he was different. The other apprentices followed the established path. They copied their master's work with faithful precision, learning to replicate his style, his techniques, his way of seeing. This was the traditional method, the proven way to train an artist through imitation, through repetition, through gradual mastery of established forms. But Leonardo could not work this way. Even as he learned the technical skills that Verrocchio taught, how to prepare a wooden panel for painting, how to mix pigments with oil to create luminous colors, how to build up layers of glaze to create depth and atmosphere, his mind was always pushing beyond the lesson itself. He did not just want to know how to paint. He wanted to know why paint behaved the way it did, what properties of light and color and human perception made one image compelling and another flat. He began to conduct his own private experiments. He studied the way shadows fell, not just accepting that they existed, but trying to understand the geometry of light that created them. He noticed that shadows were not simply black or gray, but contained subtle colors reflected from surrounding objects. He observed that the edge of a shadow was not a hard line but a gradual transition, a zone where light and darkness negotiated with each other. These observations, which seem simple now, were revolutionary then. Most artists painted shadows as dark, flat shapes. Leonardo began to paint them as living things, as part of the same optical reality as everything else in the picture. Verrocchio's workshop operated like a small kingdom with its own rules, hierarchies, and rhythms. The day began early, when the light was still soft and clean, perfect for delicate work that required precision. The youngest apprentices, the Garzoni, arrived first, tasked with the humblest duties: sweeping floors, preparing materials, running errands through the city streets. As they proved themselves capable, they were gradually given more responsibility, allowed to touch the actual work, to contribute small elements to larger compositions. A boy might spend months learning to grind a single pigment correctly, understanding the exact consistency needed, the way different minerals require different amounts of pressure and time. Only after mastering these fundamentals would he be permitted to mix colors, and only after years of training would he be trusted to apply paint to an actual commissioned work. But Leonardo moved through these stages with unusual speed. Verrocchio recognized immediately that this was no ordinary apprentice. The boy from Vinci possessed not just talent, but something deeper, a kind of visual intelligence that allowed him to see relationships others missed, to understand principles rather than simply memorizing techniques. Within his first year, Leonardo was being given tasks that normally went to senior apprentices. He prepared panels with meticulous care, applying layer after layer of gesso until the surface was smooth as silk. He mixed colors with an intuitive understanding of how pigments would interact, how certain combinations would glow while others would muddy and darken. And when he was finally permitted to paint, even his earliest attempts showed a quality that made the other apprentices pause and stare. There was a gentleness to Leonardo's figures, a softness that seemed almost impossible to achieve with brush and paint. Faces emerged from his panels with an inner life, their expressions subtle and complex rather than frozen in simple emotions. He paid attention to details that other artists ignored or simplified, the way fabric draped over a shoulder, catching light in some places and falling into shadow in others. The delicate architecture of a hand with its complex arrangement of bones and tendons. The infinite variety of human faces, no two alike, each bearing the unique signature of its owner's life and soul. While his fellow apprentices were content to master the established vocabulary of Renaissance art, Leonardo was quietly inventing a new language, one that spoke more directly to the eye, to the heart, to the mysterious place where seeing becomes feeling. The workshop was also a place of collaboration. Large commissions, altarpieces, monumental sculptures, elaborate decorative schemes required the combined efforts of multiple hands. The master would create the overall design, establish the composition and color scheme, and paint the most important elements, particularly faces and hands. The assistants would fill in backgrounds, drapery, architectural details, anything that required skill but not genius. This division of labor was accepted practice, understood by both artists and patrons. A painting attributed to Verrocchio was not necessarily painted entirely by Verrocchio, but it bore his vision, his supervision, his approval. It carried his name and his reputation. Around 1472 or 1473, when Leonardo was perhaps 20 years old, Verrocchio received a commission for a painting titled The Baptism of Christ. The composition depicted the moment when John the Baptist poured holy water over Jesus' head while angels attended and the dove of the Holy Spirit descended from heaven. Verrocchio planned the scene carefully, sketching the arrangement of figures, establishing the perspective, determining where light would fall and shadows gather. And then, as was customary, he divided the labor among his assistants. He would paint the central figures, Christ and John the Baptist. The landscape, the distant hills and river, would be handled by one assistant. And the angels, those ethereal beings who knelt in the foreground, would be given to his most promising apprentice, to Leonardo. The angel Leonardo painted became the stuff of legend. Kneeling at the left edge of the composition, the figure turned to gaze at Christ with an expression of such tender reverence that it seemed to glow from within. The face was soft, almost androgynous, with delicate features and eyes that held depths of contemplation. The hair fell in perfect ringlets, each curl catching light in a way that made it seem almost sculptural, almost alive. The fabric of the angel's robe draped across the shoulder with such naturalism that you could feel its weight, its texture. And there was something else, something harder to name, a quality of presence, of reality, that made the angels seem to exist in a different dimension from the rest of the painting. The contrast was striking, even shocking. Verrocchio's figures, competent and dignified, suddenly appeared stiff beside Leonardo's angel. They looked like what they were carefully constructed images following established conventions. Leonardo's angel looked like a living being who had momentarily consented to hold still while being painted. The difference was not merely technical, though Leonardo's technique was certainly superior. It was philosophical, metaphysical. Leonardo had found a way to paint not just the surface of things, but their inner essence, their soul. The story, passed down through generations and recorded by Giorgio Vasari in his famous Lives of the Artists, claims that Verrocchio, upon seeing what his young apprentice had achieved, was so humbled that he put down his brushes and never painted again. This is almost certainly an exaggeration, a romantic embellishment designed to emphasize Leonardo's precocious genius. Verrocchio continued to run his workshop for many years, continued to accept commissions, continued to create. But there may be a kernel of truth in the tale. Perhaps Verrocchio did recognize in that moment that his student had surpassed him in at least one crucial dimension. Perhaps he understood that Leonardo represented something new, a different order of talent that could not be explained by training alone. For Leonardo, this must have been both exhilarating and isolating. To be recognized, even quietly, as exceptional, this was what every apprentice dreamed of. But it also set him apart, created distance between him and his peers. The other young men in the workshop were his colleagues, his companions in the daily grind of artistic labor. But they were not his equals, and everyone knew it. He was the one Verrocchio watched most carefully, the one given the most challenging tasks, the one whose future seemed assured. And with that recognition came pressure, expectation, and the first stirrings of a problem that would plague Leonardo for the rest of his life, the sense that nothing he created was ever quite finished, never quite perfect enough to match the vision in his mind. He was still a young man, still living in his master's workshop, still technically an apprentice. But already the pattern was forming. Already Leonardo was becoming himself brilliant, obsessive, restless, capable of extraordinary beauty, but unable to be satisfied with mere excellence. The hills of Vinci had taught him to see. Florence was teaching him to create. But no one, not even Verrocchio, could teach him to stop questioning, to stop reaching for something just beyond the edge of what was possible. That drive, that hunger, was his alone, and it would carry him to heights of genius that no one in the workshop could imagine. It would also make him, in many ways, forever solitary, a man whose mind moved faster and farther than anyone around him could follow. Florence in those years was not merely a city of art. It was a city of power, intrigue, and carefully balanced tensions. The Medici family, wealthy beyond measure from their banking empire, ruled without technically ruling, holding no official titles but controlling nearly everything through patronage, influence, and strategic marriages. Lorenzo de' Medici, known as Lorenzo the Magnificent, was in his prime a poet, a patron, a political mastermind who understood that art was not separate from power but a manifestation of it. To commission a great work was to declare your status, your taste, your understanding of what mattered. And so the wealthy families of Florence competed with each other through art, each trying to outdo the others in magnificence, in beauty, in the sheer audacity of their vision. The streets themselves reflected this competition. New palaces rose along the avenues, their facades decorated with elaborate stonework, their interiors filled with frescoes and sculptures. Churches commissioned altarpieces that grew ever more complex, ever more stunning. Even the guilds, the powerful organizations that controlled different trades and professions, commissioned art to glorify their own importance. Into this world of ambition and beauty, Leonardo was emerging not just as a talented apprentice, but as an artist in his own right, someone whose name was beginning to be whispered among those who paid attention to such things. By 1472, at the age of 20, Leonardo was admitted to the Florentine Painters Guild, the Compagnia di San Luca. This was a significant milestone, a formal recognition that he had completed his apprenticeship and was now qualified to accept commissions independently. He could, if he wished, leave Verrocchio's workshop and establish his own practice. But Leonardo did not leave. He remained in the bottega for several more years, partly out of loyalty, partly because the workshop provided resources and connections he could not yet afford on his own, and partly, perhaps, because he was not quite ready to face the full weight of independence. In Verrocchio's workshop, he could still be a student, still be learning, still be protected from the harsh realities of the market, where patrons demanded results on schedule and beauty had to be delivered according to contract. During these transitional years, Leonardo began to take on his own projects, small commissions that came to him personally rather than through the workshop. One of his earliest known independent works was a drawing, now lost but described in historical records, of the Arno Valley as seen from the hills above Florence. The drawing was dated August 5, 1473. In Leonardo's own hand, one of the few drawings he ever dated, suggesting it held particular meaning for him. It depicted the landscape of his childhood, the rolling hills and winding river, the patchwork of fields and forests, all rendered with meticulous attention to geological detail. Even then, Leonardo was not content to simply copy what he saw. He was studying it, analyzing the way erosion shaped valleys, the way water carved channels through stone, the way vegetation grew in patterns determined by sun and slope. This drawing revealed something essential about Leonardo's mind. For him, there was no separation between art and science, between beauty and knowledge. To paint a landscape convincingly, you had to understand how landscapes formed, how they evolved over time, how natural forces shaped them. To paint water, you had to study fluid dynamics, the mathematics of motion, the physics of flow. And to paint the human figure, which would become his greatest obsession, you had to understand anatomy, not superficially, but profoundly, down to the level of muscles and tendons and the way bones articulated in their sockets. This approach was unusual, even radical. Most artists learned conventions and repeated them. Leonardo wanted to understand principles and discover them anew. But Florence in the 1470s was also a place of darkness where the brilliance of the Renaissance cast deep shadows. Beneath the surface of civic pride and artistic achievement, there were tensions between rich and poor, between different political factions, between the church's moral authority and the increasingly secular humanism of the intellectual class. And there was always the possibility of accusation, of rumor, of scandal that could destroy a reputation overnight. In 1476, Leonardo found himself caught in one of these shadows. An anonymous denunciation was placed in one of the tamburi, the special boxes where Florentines could report crimes or moral transgressions, accusing Leonardo and several other young men of sodomy, of engaging in sexual acts with a 17-year-old male model and apprentice goldsmith. Homosexuality was officially illegal in Renaissance Florence, punishable by fines, public shaming, or worse. But it was also widely practiced, particularly in artistic circles, and the laws were enforced inconsistently, often depending on the accused's social status and connections. Leonardo was arrested along with the others, held briefly, and then released when no witnesses came forward to testify. The charges were eventually dropped, but the stain remained. 2 months later, another denunciation appeared, naming the same men. Again, no witnesses. Again, the charges dissolved. But Leonardo had learned a harsh lesson about vulnerability, about how quickly the world could turn hostile, how easily a life could be disrupted by whispers and suspicions. The experience may have contributed to what would become a lifelong pattern of guardedness. Leonardo was never one to reveal himself easily, never one to let others see too deeply into his private thoughts and feelings. His notebooks, though filled with observations and ideas, rarely contained personal reflections or emotional confessions. He kept himself at a distance, protected behind layers of courtesy and intellectual discourse. And he threw himself even more deeply into work, into the endless exploration of how things worked and why they looked the way they did. Work was safe. Knowledge was safe. The world inside his mind, where he could dissect and analyze and create, was a world he could control. In those years, he painted a portrait, one of his earliest surviving works, of a young woman holding an ermine. She was Cecilia Gallerani, the mistress of Ludovico Sforza, the Duke of Milan, and the painting was likely commissioned as a gift or a memento. The portrait, known now as Lady with an Ermine, shows Leonardo's developing mastery. Cecilia turns to look over her shoulder, her face captured in three-quarter view, her expression intelligent and alert. The ermine she holds is rendered with such precision that every hair seems individually painted, its small black eyes bright with life. The painting demonstrates Leonardo's growing interest in capturing not just physical appearance, but psychological presence, the sense that the person in the portrait has thoughts, feelings, a complex inner world. But even as his reputation grew, even as commissions began to come more frequently, Leonardo remained restless. Florence, for all its magnificence, was beginning to feel too small, too familiar. He had learned everything Verrocchia could teach him. He had mastered the technical skills of painting and sculpture. He had proven himself capable of creating beauty that could rival anyone in the city, and yet something was missing. He wanted more than to be a successful artist producing works on commission for wealthy patrons. He wanted to explore, to experiment, to push beyond the boundaries of what art was supposed to be. He wanted to understand everything, not just painting, but architecture, engineering, mathematics, anatomy, astronomy, the whole vast encyclopedia of human knowledge. And so, in the early 1480s, Leonardo made a decision that would shape the rest of his life. He would leave Florence, leave the city that had trained him and made him, and seek his fortune elsewhere. Milan was calling, a different city, a different patron, a different set of possibilities. He was nearly 30 years old, no longer a boy from the hills, no longer an apprentice learning his trade. He was Leonardo da Vinci, artist and engineer, a man with a mind full of dreams and hands capable of bringing them into reality. The first chapter of his life was ending. The next was about to begin, and it would take him places no one, not even he himself, could fully imagine. The hills of Tuscany remained behind him, quiet and unchanging, keeping their secrets. But the boy who had walked those hills was gone forever, transformed into something both more and less than ordinary, a genius, a visionary, a man perpetually out of step with his own time, forever reaching toward a future only he could see. Chapter 2. Apprentice to the Masters. Florence in the late 15th century was a city that breathed ambition. Its air was thick with marble dust and possibility, and along its narrow streets, genius walked shoulder to shoulder with commerce. The Arno River cut through its heart like a silver vein, its waters carrying both trade and reflection, and on its banks rose buildings that seemed to defy the limitations of stone and mortar. This was the city Leonardo entered as a young apprentice, leaving behind the gentle hills of his childhood for something far more complex, far more demanding, far more alive. He was 14 years old, and the world he was stepping into would either break him or make him immortal. There was no middle ground for a mind like his. Andrea del Verrocchio's workshop stood in the parish of San Ambrogio, in a neighborhood where the sound of hammers on metal and chisels on stone formed a constant symphony. The building itself was substantial, large enough to house multiple projects simultaneously, with high ceilings that allowed natural light to pour through windows, illuminating the workspace with the kind of clear, even brightness that artists needed. This was not merely a place where paintings were created. It was a comprehensive artistic enterprise, a factory of beauty that produced sculptures in bronze and marble, paintings on wood panel, decorative metalwork, architectural designs, even theatrical sets and costumes for the elaborate pageants that Florence loved. To be accepted into Verrocchio's bottega was to enter one of the most prestigious artistic institutions in Italy, and Leonardo arrived with nothing but his talent and a bundle of drawings that had convinced the master to take a chance on an illegitimate boy from the countryside. The hierarchy of the workshop was strict and clearly defined. At the top stood Verrocchio himself, the master whose reputation and connections brought in the commissions that kept everyone employed. Beneath him were the senior assistants, experienced artists who had completed their apprenticeships but remained in the workshop either because they preferred the security of steady employment or because they had not yet established their own reputations. Then came the apprentices in various stages of training, from the newest boys who knew nothing to those on the verge of joining the guild and becoming independent masters. And at the bottom were the servants and laborers who performed the truly menial tasks, hauling water, maintaining tools, cleaning up the endless mess that artistic production generated. Leonardo entered at the bottom, as everyone did, and his first months were spent on tasks that had nothing to do with painting or sculpture. He learned to prepare wooden panels, a process that required precision and patience. First, the wood had to be properly seasoned, dried slowly to prevent warping. Then it was joined and glued, multiple pieces fitted together to create a surface large enough for the intended painting. The surface was then covered with strips of linen soaked in glue, reinforcing the joints and creating a unified plane. Over this went multiple layers of gesso, a mixture of chalk or gypsum and glue, each layer applied and allowed to dry before the next. The final surface was sanded until it was smooth as ivory, perfect for receiving paint. One poorly prepared panel could crack or warp over time, ruining months of work, so the process was treated with respect bordering on reverence. He learned to grind pigments, transforming raw minerals into the powders that would become color. This too was skilled labor, more complex than it appeared. Different materials required different approaches. Lapis lazuli, imported at great expense from Afghanistan, had to be ground carefully to preserve its brilliant blue while removing impurities. Earth pigments, ochres and umbers and siennas needed to be processed to achieve consistent particle sizes. Some materials were toxic lead white, cinnabar, orpiment, and had to be handled with care. Leonardo ground pigments for hours, days, weeks, learning the properties of each substance, how it behaved when mixed with oil or egg tempera, how it would appear when applied in thin glazes versus thick impasto. His hands became stained with color, his lungs filled with fine dust, and his mind absorbed information that would later allow him to manipulate paint with a subtlety no one had achieved before. The workshop operated from dawn until dusk, 6 days a week, with Sundays reserved for rest and religious observance. The rhythm was relentless but not harsh. Verrocchio was demanding but not cruel, and he understood that young minds needed variety to stay engaged. So Leonardo was rotated through different tasks, spending time in each area of the workshop's operation. He worked alongside the sculptors, learning how to shape clay models that would later be cast in bronze. He watched the senior assistants mix oil paint, combining pigments with linseed oil and sometimes varnish, adjusting the proportions to achieve different consistencies and drying times. He studied the way Verrocchio himself worked, observing the master's decisive brushstrokes, his confidence in placing dark beside light, his ability to suggest three-dimensional form on a flat surface. But Leonardo did more than observe and imitate. Even in those early years, he was analyzing, questioning, trying to understand the principles beneath the techniques. When Verrocchio demonstrated how to paint drapery, how to suggest the weight of fabric, the way it fell in folds and caught light, Leonardo did not simply memorize the method. He studied actual fabric, hanging cloth from the workshop ceiling and arranging it in various configurations, then sketching it from different angles, trying to understand the geometry of how fabric behaved. He noticed that the folds were not random, but followed predictable patterns based on the fabric's weight and stiffness, the angle at which it hung, the forces acting upon it. This analytical approach set him apart from the other apprentices, who were content to learn the conventions and apply them. Leonardo wanted to understand reality itself so that he could depict it with absolute fidelity. His fellow apprentices were a varied group, young men drawn from different backgrounds, but united by their desire to master the art that Florence celebrated above all others. Pietro Perugino, several years older than Leonardo, was steady and reliable, with a gift for creating harmonious compositions that pleased patrons without challenging them. Lorenzo di Credi, closer to Leonardo's age, was meticulous and careful, someone who followed instructions precisely and produced work of consistent quality. There were others too, their names mostly lost to history. Boys who learned the trade and went on to decorate churches in smaller towns or produce portraits for merchants who could not afford the famous masters. Among these young men, Leonardo was both part of the group and somehow separate from it. He participated in the daily rhythms of workshop life, sharing meals and jokes, joining in the roughhousing that erupted during breaks, contributing to the collective labor that every large commission required. But there was always a quality of elsewhere about him, as though part of his attention remained focused on something invisible to the others. While they chatted about girls or gossip or the latest political scandal, Leonardo might be staring at the way afternoon light filtered through a window, creating patterns of brightness and shadow on the floor, his mind working to decode the mathematics of illumination. He filled notebooks with observations, a habit that would continue throughout his life. These were not formal journals or organized treatises, but rather collections of whatever caught his interest, a quick sketch of a hand in an unusual position, notes about the mixture ratios for a particular shade of green, geometric diagrams exploring the properties of curves and angles, anatomical studies copied from medical texts or, increasingly, from his own direct observation. The notebooks were private, written in his distinctive mirror script right to left, each letter reversed, which made them difficult for others to read. Some scholars believe this was a deliberate code to protect his ideas. Others suggest it was simply the natural writing style of a left-handed person trying to avoid smudging ink. Whatever the reason, the notebooks became Leonardo's true companions, the repository of his ceaseless curiosity. Verrocchio recognized that this apprentice was different, and he adjusted his teaching accordingly. While other students were given clear instructions and expected to follow them precisely, Leonardo was allowed more freedom to experiment, to try alternative approaches, to occasionally fail in interesting ways. This was a gift, though it came with its own burden. Freedom meant responsibility. It meant that when Leonardo was given a task, more was expected of him than mere competence. Verrocchio was testing him, pushing him, seeing how far this unusual talent could stretch. One of the first significant tests came with the commission for the baptism of Christ, the painting that would become legendary for the contrast between master and student. The work was intended for the monastery of San Salvi, just outside Florence, and it depicted the moment when Christ submitted himself to baptism in the Jordan River. Verrocchio planned the composition with his usual care, Christ standing in the shallow water at the center, John the Baptist pouring water over his head from a simple bowl, angels kneeling in attendance, and above them all, the dove of the Holy Spirit descending from a luminous sky. It was a traditional subject, painted countless times before, but Verrocchio intended to bring his own clarity and grace to the scene. As was standard practice, he divided the work among his assistants according to their abilities. He reserved the central figures for himself, Christ and John the Baptist, the two most important characters in the drama, whose faces and gestures would carry the spiritual weight of the moment. The landscape in the background, with its distant hills and winding river, would be handled by another assistant. And the angels, those ethereal witnesses kneeling in the left foreground, were assigned to Leonardo. It was both an honor and a challenge. Angels were not easy subjects. They had to appear both human and otherworldly, beautiful but not vain, reverent without being stiff. And they would occupy a prominent position in the composition, immediately visible to anyone viewing the painting. Leonardo approached the task with his characteristic intensity. He did not simply sit down and begin painting. First, he drew. He filled pages with studies of angels, exploring different poses, different expressions, different ways of arranging the drapery that would clothe them. He drew from life, asking other apprentices to pose for him, studying the way real bodies moved, how weight shifted, how muscles flexed beneath skin. But he also drew from imagination, pushing beyond mere realism towards something more refined, more idealized. He was searching for a quality that existed somewhere between the earthly and the divine, a face that could believably belong to a creature who dwelt in heaven but had descended briefly to witness this sacred moment. When he finally began to paint, the other apprentices noticed something extraordinary happening. The angel emerging from Leonardo's brush was unlike anything they had seen before. The face was soft, almost luminous, with features so delicate they seemed barely to disrupt the surface of the panel. The eyes gazed toward Christ with an expression of profound tenderness, a look that suggested both worship and understanding. The hair fell in perfect ringlets, each curl catching light in a way that gave it sculptural presence, as though it had weight and volume and existed in actual space rather than merely being suggested by brushstrokes. And the hands one raised in a gesture of reverence, the other supporting the angel's kneeling posture, were rendered with such anatomical precision that you could see the subtle structure of bones beneath the skin, the way tendons emerged at the wrist, the individual character of each finger. But what made the angel truly remarkable was harder to define. It was a quality of presence, of inner life. This was not a symbolic representation of an angel, a conventional figure arranged according to traditional iconography. This was a being who seemed to possess consciousness, who appeared to be experiencing the moment rather than simply illustrating it. The angel's expression suggested thought, feeling, a complex interior world. When you looked at this figure, you felt you were seeing an actual witness to the baptism, someone who understood the magnitude of what was happening and responded to it with appropriate awe. The contrast with Verrocchio's work was stark. The master had painted the central figures with competence and dignity, following established conventions for depicting Christ and John the Baptist. The figures were well proportioned, clearly drawn, appropriately solemn. But they were also somewhat static, formal, occupying space without quite inhabiting it. They looked like what they were carefully executed images adhering to religious tradition. Leonardo's angel, by contrast, seemed to exist in a different dimension of reality. It possessed a vitality, a sense of lived experience that made the other figures appear almost wooden by comparison. The workshop fell silent when Verrocchio stood before the completed painting, studying what his young apprentice had achieved. The other students watched their master's face, trying to read his reaction. Verrocchio was known for his professional pride, his confidence in his own abilities. How would he respond to being so clearly surpassed by a student barely out of his teens? For a long moment, he said nothing, just looked at the painting with an expression that was difficult to interpret. Then he turned to Leonardo and gave a small nod, a gesture of acknowledgement that contained more meaning than words could convey. The story that would be told in later years that Verrocchio immediately put down his brushes and never painted again was, like most legends, an exaggeration shaped by the human love of dramatic narrative. The truth was more complex and, in its own way, more interesting. Verrocchio did not abandon painting, but something shifted in his relationship with the medium. He began to focus more intently on sculpture, on bronze work, on architectural projects, where his skills as an engineer and designer could shine without inviting direct comparison to the uncanny naturalism that Leonardo was developing. It was not defeat, exactly, but rather a recognition, a master acknowledging that his student had discovered something beyond what he himself could teach. A quality that could not be transmitted through instruction, but could only emerge from a particular kind of genius. For Leonardo, the success brought its own complications. He was now marked as exceptional, which meant that expectations followed him like a shadow. Every subsequent task would be measured against that angel, every painting scrutinized for evidence of the same transcendent quality. And Leonardo himself became more self-critical, more aware of the gap between what he could envision and what he could actually achieve. The angel in the baptism of Christ represented a moment of perfect synthesis, when intention and execution aligned completely. But Leonardo knew, even then, that such moments were rare, that the process of creation was usually a struggle against the limitations of materials, of technique, of his own human fallibility. He remained in Verrocchio's workshop even after completing his formal apprenticeship, even after being admitted to the Painters Guild in 1472. The workshop provided resources he could not afford: independently expensive pigments, large working spaces, connections to potential patrons. And there was still much to learn, particularly in areas outside painting. Verrocchio was equally renowned as a sculptor, and Leonardo absorbed lessons in three-dimensional form. in the way masses balanced and volumes related to one another in actual space rather than the illusionistic space of a painted surface. He learned how to work in clay, building up forms gradually, understanding how to create armatures that would support the weight of the sculpture. He studied the lost wax process of bronze casting, a complex procedure that required precise planning and careful execution to transform a clay model into permanent metal. The workshop also gave him access to the intellectual culture of Florence, which was reaching unprecedented heights during these years. The Medici family had established a kind of informal academy, gathering scholars, philosophers, poets, and artists for conversations that ranged across all domains of knowledge. Marsilio Ficino was translating Plato into Latin, recovering ancient wisdom that had been lost for centuries. Pico della Mirandola was crafting his famous oration on the dignity of man, arguing that human beings were not fixed in their nature, but could shape themselves through their choices. Angelo Poliziano was writing poetry that merged classical forms with contemporary sensibility. And Lorenzo de' Medici himself, the de facto ruler of Florence, was both a patron of these activities and an active participant, writing his own verses and engaging in philosophical debates. Leonardo moved at the edges of this circle, never quite at its center, but present enough to absorb its ideas. His lack of formal education, his inability to read Latin fluently, his limited knowledge of classical texts kept him from full participation in scholarly discussions. But he listened, and he translated what he heard into his own terms, into questions about observation and experience rather than textual authority. The humanists celebrated ancient wisdom, looking to Greek and Roman sources for guidance. Leonardo celebrated nature itself, arguing that direct observation was superior to inherited knowledge, that the eye was a more reliable guide than even the most revered book. This was a radical position, though he expressed it quietly, without confrontation. He was developing his own philosophy, his own method, one that would eventually influence the development of modern science itself. During these years, he took on his first independent commissions, projects that came to him personally rather than through the workshop. In 1478, he received a commission for an altarpiece to be placed in the chapel of the Palazzo Vecchio, Florence's seat of government. It was a significant opportunity, a chance to create a major work for a prominent public location. But Leonardo struggled with it. He produced drawings, worked out compositional schemes, began the painting. And then he stalled, got distracted, failed to complete it on schedule. The commission was eventually reassigned to another artist, and Leonardo had to return the advance payment he had received. It was the first clear sign of a pattern that would repeat throughout his career's brilliant beginnings, followed by difficulty finishing. An inability to bring projects to conclusion because his vision kept evolving, because he kept seeing new possibilities, new problems to solve, new layers of complexity. He was more successful with another commission from the same period, a painting of the Annunciation for the monastery of San Bartolomeo. The work depicted the moment when the angel Gabriel appeared to the Virgin Mary to announce that she would bear the Son of God. It was a traditional subject, but Leonardo approached it with fresh eyes. He set the scene in a carefully rendered architectural space, with Mary seated at a reading desk beside a garden, the angel kneeling before her in a pose of graceful reverence. The painting demonstrated Leonardo's growing mastery of perspective, the mathematical system that allowed artists to create convincing illusions of three-dimensional space on flat surfaces. But it also showed his attention to naturalistic detail, the flowers in the garden painted with botanical accuracy, the fabric of Mary's dress falling in folds that followed the actual behavior of cloth, the angel's wings studied from real birds and rendered with ornithological precision. Yet even in this early work, there were signs of Leonardo's distinctive approach. The faces were soft, gentle, with the same quality of inner life that he had achieved in the Angel of the Baptism. The gestures were subtle rather than theatrical, suggesting genuine human response rather than conventional symbolism. And the light was handled with a delicacy that went beyond standard practice, creating an atmosphere that was almost palpable, as though the air itself had weight and texture. Leonardo was not content simply to illustrate a story. He wanted to create an experience, to transport the viewer into the scene, to make the painted world feel as real and immediate as the actual world. But for all his growing reputation, for all the evidence of his extraordinary talent, Leonardo remained restless, unsatisfied, searching for something he could not quite name. Florence was filled with artists, many of them brilliant, all of them competing for the same commissions from the same pool of patrons. Success meant producing work steadily, reliably, meeting deadlines and satisfying clients. It meant building a workshop of your own, taking on apprentices, managing the business side of art along with the creative side. And Leonardo was discovering that he was not well suited to this model. His mind moved too quickly, in too many directions at once. He would begin a painting with enthusiasm, work on it intensely for weeks, and then his attention would be captured by some other problem: how to design a more efficient canal lock, how to calculate the trajectory of projectiles, how the human eye actually processed visual information. The other artists of Florence learned to manage their genius, to channel it into productive forms that satisfied patrons and sustained careers. Sandro Botticelli, several years older than Leonardo, had mastered this balance, creating paintings of extraordinary beauty while maintaining a successful workshop and meeting his obligations. Domenico Ghirlandaio ran his bottega like a well-oiled machine, producing frescoes and altarpieces with impressive efficiency. Even Perugino, Leonardo's former fellow apprentice, had developed a reliable style and a professional approach that would bring him wealth and steady employment. But Leonardo could not, or would not, conform to this pattern. Each project became an opportunity for experimentation, for pushing beyond established methods, for investigating problems that interested him even if they had nothing to do with the immediate task. His notebooks from this period reveal the breadth of his curiosity. Alongside studies for paintings, sketches of faces, drapery studies, compositional diagrams, there are pages devoted to mechanics, to hydraulics, to geometry. He drew elaborate machines, some practical and some fantastical, exploring the principles of gears and levers, of pulleys and springs. He sketched fortifications and weapons, imagining new ways to attack and defend. He studied the flight of birds with obsessive attention, filling page after page with observations about wing movements, air currents, the mechanics of takeoff and landing. And increasingly, he became fascinated with the human body, with the mystery of how flesh and blood and bone came together to create consciousness, movement, life itself. This fascination led him to anatomy, though at first from a purely artistic perspective. Artists needed to understand the body in order to depict it convincingly. This was accepted wisdom. But most artists learned anatomy superficially, memorizing conventions about proportion and gesture, perhaps studying Eckerchi figures that showed muscles in simplified form. Leonardo wanted deeper knowledge. He wanted to see inside, to understand not just what the body looked like, but how it worked, what mechanisms drove it, what principles governed its operation. And so he began to seek access to corpses, a pursuit that was both practically difficult and morally complicated in a culture where the body was considered sacred, where dissection was restricted and viewed with suspicion. He managed, through connections whose exact nature remains unclear, to obtain permission to dissect bodies at the Hospital of Santa Maria Nuova in Florence. The work had to be done quickly, before decay made it impossible, and often by candlelight in cold rooms where the smell was overpowering. Leonardo approached these sessions with the same careful attention he brought to everything else. He dissected slowly, methodically, recording what he found in drawings of unprecedented accuracy and detail. He drew the bones, understanding how they articulated, how joints allowed movement while maintaining structural integrity. He traced the pathways of muscles, noting how they attached to bone, how they contracted to produce motion. He followed blood vessels, mapping their routes through the body, trying to understand the circulatory system decades before William Harvey would describe it properly. These anatomical studies were not intended for publication. They were private investigations driven by Leonardo's personal need to understand. But they gave him knowledge that transformed his art. When he painted a hand, he knew exactly what lay beneath the skin, which tendons emerged at the wrist, how the small bones of the fingers arranged themselves, why certain positions were natural and others strained. When he depicted a net turning, he understood the complex interplay of muscles that made that movement possible. His figures began to possess an anatomical truth that went beyond surface appearance, a quality of organic coherence that made them feel genuinely alive. But this depth of knowledge also contributed to his difficulty with completion. The more he understood, the more complex each painting became, the more decisions required careful consideration. A simple gesture involved dozens of anatomical details, each of which had to be correct. A face was not just a collection of features, but an expression of underlying structure, skull shape determining the broad planes, muscles creating the subtle variations, skin lying over everything with its own texture and translucency. To paint with absolute fidelity to this knowledge required immense concentration and time, far more than patrons typically allowed or expected. In 1481, Leonardo received what should have been a career-defining commission. The monks of San Donato Escopido, just outside Florence, hired him to paint an altarpiece depicting the adoration of the Magi, the moment when the Phantom, three wise men, arrived to pay homage to the infant Christ. It was a complex composition requiring numerous figures, elaborate architectural and landscape backgrounds, a scene filled with movement and emotion. Leonardo threw himself into the project with characteristic intensity. He created dozens of preparatory drawings, working out the arrangement of figures, the architecture of the background, the expressions and gestures of individual characters. He began an underpainting, establishing the basic composition in monochrome, building up the structure that would eventually support layers of color. And then, in 1482, before the painting was anywhere near completion, Leonardo left Florence. He abandoned the commission, abandoned the contract he had signed, abandoned the months of work he had already invested. He packed his belongings, gathered a few drawings and personal possessions, and traveled north to Milan, accepting an invitation to the court of Ludovico Sforza, Duke of Milan. The monks of San Donato were left with an unfinished panel, a ghost of what might have been, and eventually hired another artist to create an altarpiece in Leonardo's place. The incomplete work, now known as the Adoration of the Magi, would remain in its underpainting state, a fascinating but frustrating glimpse into Leonardo's creative process, a testament to both his genius and his inability to bring that genius to completion. Why did he leave? The practical reason was opportunity. Milan was a wealthy court with a powerful duke who needed artists, engineers, designers for military and civic projects. The position offered security, resources, the chance to work on a grander scale than Florence could provide. But there was something else too, something deeper. Florence had become too familiar, too constraining. The artistic community there knew him, had expectations of him, judged him according to standards he was increasingly unable or unwilling to meet. In Milan, he could reinvent himself, present himself not just as a painter, but as a universal genius, a man who could design weapons and buildings, stage elaborate theatrical productions, plan irrigation systems, and yes, occasionally paint masterpieces when the mood struck him. The letter Leonardo wrote to Ludovico Sforza, seeking employment, reveals his ambitions. In it, he lists his abilities: designing portable bridges for military campaigns, creating siege weapons and defensive fortifications, building canals and water systems, sculpting in marble and bronze, and almost as an afterthought, at the very end of a long list, painting anything that might be required. This was Leonardo announcing himself as something new, something the Renaissance had not quite seen before. Not merely an artist, but an inventor, an engineer, a designer of the future. He was 30 years old, already marked by the pattern of brilliance and incompletion that would define his career, already aware that his mind worked differently from others, already searching for a context that could contain his restless, ranging genius. Verrocchio's workshop had taught him the fundamentals, had given him the technical mastery that would allow him to create works of transcendent beauty. But it had also shown him the limitations of conventional artistic practice, the gap between what patrons wanted and what he felt compelled to explore. The years in Florence had been formative, essential, transformative, but they were finished now. The apprentice was leaving his master, not in anger or rebellion, but in pursuit of something larger, something he could not yet fully articulate, but could feel pulling at him like an invisible tide. Chapter 3: The Wandering Genius. Milan greeted Leonardo with cold winds and new possibilities. It was a city different in character from Florence, less polished, less concerned with classical beauty, but more powerful, more pragmatic, more interested in the machinery of rule than the refinement of art. Where Florence was a republic governed by wealthy merchants who competed through patronage and taste, Milan was a duchy ruled by the Sforza family who had seized power through military force and maintained it through strategic alliances and sheer will. Ludovico Sforza, known as Il Moro, the Moor for his dark complexion, was not a hereditary duke, but a usurper who had maneuvered his way to power and now needed to legitimize his rule through displays of magnificence, through projects that would demonstrate his worthiness to lead. Leonardo arrived in this environment in 1482, a 30-year-old artist with an unfinished reputation and a letter full of promises about what he could achieve. The letter he had written to Ludovico was bold, almost audacious in its claims. He presented himself primarily as a military engineer, offering to design bridges that could be assembled and disassembled quickly for army movements, siege weapons that could hurl stones with unprecedented force, armored vehicles that could break through enemy lines, ships that could not be burned, and fortifications that could withstand any assault. Only at the end, almost casually, did he mention his abilities as a sculptor and painter. This emphasis was strategic. Ludovico was engaged in constant political maneuvering, always preparing for the possibility of war, always seeking advantages over rival states. A painter, however talented, was a luxury. An engineer who could provide military superiority was essential. Whether Ludovico actually read the letter or whether Leonardo gained his position through other connections remains uncertain. What is clear is that he was welcomed into the Milanese court and given a position that was vague in its definition but broad in its possibilities. He was not merely hired to produce specific works, but rather kept on retainer, available for whatever projects the Duke might require. This suited Leonardo perfectly. It gave him financial security without the pressure of constant deadlines, freedom to explore his varied interests without having to justify how each pursuit related to a specific commission. He could spend months designing a canal system, then shift to planning a theatrical production, then work on a painting, all under the general umbrella of serving the Duke's interests. Milan itself was a revelation. The city was larger than Florence, more cosmopolitically diverse, positioned at the crossroads of trade routes that connected Italy to the rest of Europe. Its cathedral, still under construction after a century of work, rose in elaborate Gothic splendor, its white marble facade carved with thousands of figures and decorative elements. The Castello Sforzesco, the massive fortress where Ludovico held court, dominated the northwestern corner of the city. Its thick walls and defensive towers a reminder that power rested ultimately on the ability to defend it. The streets were filled with soldiers, merchants, diplomats, artists, scholars, adventurers, people drawn from across the continent by the wealth and influence that Milan commanded. Leonardo established himself in a workshop, gathering around him a small group of assistants and students. Among them was a boy of about 10 named Gian Giacomo Caprodi, who entered Leonardo's household in 1490 and would remain connected to him for the rest of his life. Leonardo nicknamed him Sly Little Devil because of his beauty and his mischievous nature. The boy was a troublemaker, stealing from Leonardo and from guests, breaking things, behaving badly, yet Leonardo kept him close, seemed almost unable to send him away despite the endless frustrations he caused. The relationship was complex, certainly affectionate, possibly romantic, and it reveals something about Leonardo's emotional life that his notebooks, for all their thousands of pages, rarely directly address. In Milan, Leonardo's notebooks proliferated, filled with an ever-expanding range of subjects. He sketched constantly, his hand moving across the page with restless energy, capturing ideas before they could escape. His drawing style was distinctive, quick, economical lines that suggested form with minimal marks, cross-hatching that built up shadow through layers of parallel strokes, a sense of movement and life even in static objects. He drew everything, faces glimpsed in the street, particularly interesting or grotesque ones that caught his attention, horses in every conceivable position, studied for a massive equestrian monument he was planning, mechanical devices of his own invention, studies of water flowing, splashing, forming vortices and waves, plants and flowers examined with botanical precision, architectural fantasies of centrally planned churches and ideal cities. The notebooks also contained writing, though often fragmentary and disorganized. Leonardo wrote the way he drew quickly, following his thoughts wherever they led, jumping from topic to topic as new ideas occurred to him. He made lists of things to investigate, questions to answer, books to read, people to consult. He recorded observations about natural phenomena, why the sky is blue, how cracks form in walls, what causes echoes. He drafted letters that may or may not have been sent. He worked out mathematical problems, exploring geometry and proportion. He wrote fables and allegories, short moral tales in the style popular at the time. And he made notes about his daily life: money spent, debts owed, reminders to buy socks or get a cloak repaired, comments about people he knew. The notebooks were his external memory, his laboratory, his diary, his sketchbook, all combined into a sprawling, chaotic record of an endlessly curious mind. One of his first major projects in Milan was designing sets and costumes for theatrical productions. The Milanese court loved elaborate spectacles, pageants that combined drama, music, dance, and spectacular visual effects. These productions were not mere entertainment, but political tools, displays of the court's sophistication and wealth, intended to impress foreign dignitaries and reinforce Ludovico's status. Leonardo threw himself into this work with enthusiasm. He designed mechanical stages that could transform before the audience's eyes, revealing hidden scenes through ingenious systems of pulleys and counterweights. He created costumes that were works of art in themselves, decorated with symbolic imagery and constructed to allow dramatic movement. He devised special effects, clouds that descended from above, stars that glittered with hidden lights, gods and angels who seemed to fly through the air. This work, though ephemeral, the productions lasting only a night or two before being dismantled, was valuable training. It required him to think three-dimensionally, to consider how objects would look from multiple viewpoints, to solve engineering problems under tight deadlines. It also connected him to the intellectual life of the court, to poets and musicians and scholars who contributed to these productions. He became known not just as an artist, but as a universal talent, someone who could turn his hand to anything, who brought the same combination of imagination and technical precision to every challenge. But the project that would consume Leonardo's attention for years, the commission that seemed to promise immortality, was the great equestrian monument to Francesco Sforza, Ludovico's father, and the founder of the Sforza dynasty. Ludovico wanted to honor his father with the largest bronze horse statue ever created, a monument so magnificent that it would surpass all the famous equestrian sculptures of antiquity. It would stand in the center of Milan, a permanent testament to Sforza power and grandeur, and Leonardo was given the responsibility of designing and creating it. This was exactly the kind of ambitious, almost impossible project that Leonardo craved, something that would require him to solve problems no one had solved before, to push the boundaries of what was technically achievable. He approached the project with characteristic thoroughness. First, he needed to understand horses completely, not superficially, but with the same depth of knowledge he had brought to human anatomy. He spent countless hours in the stables, observing horses in motion and at rest, studying the play of muscles beneath their skin, the articulation of their joints, the precise proportions of their bodies. He dissected horse cadavers, mapping their internal structure, understanding how the skeletons supported the massive weight, how tendons and ligaments allowed for explosive power. He filled notebooks with horse studies, hundreds of drawings capturing every angle, every position, every detail of equine anatomy. These were not merely preparatory sketches for the monument. They were scientific investigations, comprehensive studies that would allow him to create a horse more anatomically perfect than any sculpted before. The technical challenges were immense. Bronze casting on this scale had never been attempted. The monument was to be over 20 feet tall, requiring many tons of bronze. The casting would have to be done in a single pour to avoid visible seams, which meant constructing an enormous furnace capable of melting that much metal simultaneously, then channeling it into the mold without mishap. A single error, crack in the mold, an air pocket in the bronze, an uneven flow of molten metal could ruin months or years of work and waste a fortune in materials. Leonardo studied ancient texts on bronze casting, consulted with foundry workers, conducted experiments with smaller models, trying to work out every detail of the process before committing to the final work. He also had to decide on the pose. Early designs showed the horse rearing up on its hind legs, a dramatically dynamic composition that would have been unprecedented in its ambition. But such a pose created additional structural problems. Bronze is heavy, and supporting the entire weight of a rearing horse on just two legs, even with an internal armature, risked collapse or deformation over time. After years of consideration and experimentation, Leonardo revised the design to show the horse in a more stable walking pose, one leg raised but the other three firmly planted. It was less dramatic but more feasible, and it still allowed him to display the horse's power and nobility. By 1493, Leonardo had completed a full-scale clay model over 20 feet tall, a masterpiece of sculptural art even in its temporary form. It was displayed publicly during celebrations for the marriage of Ludovico's niece, and it caused a sensation. People came from across Italy to see it, marveling at its anatomical precision, its sense of contained power, its sheer scale. Poets wrote verses praising it. Other artists studied it, recognizing that Leonardo had achieved something extraordinary. The clay model alone secured his reputation, proving that his ambitions were not empty boasts but genuine capabilities. Now all that remained was the casting, the transformation of clay into eternal bronze. But the bronze never came. Ludovico, increasingly concerned about military threats from France, requisitioned the metal that had been set aside for the monument and had it cast into cannons instead. The project was postponed, indefinitely delayed, eventually abandoned. The clay model remained standing for several years, slowly deteriorating as weather and time took their toll. When French troops invaded Milan in 1499, overthrowing Ludovico and ending Sforza rule, soldiers used the model for target practice, shooting arrows at it until it collapsed into fragments. Leonardo's greatest sculptural ambition, the project that had consumed more than a decade of his life, vanished completely, leaving behind only the hundreds of preparatory drawings in his notebooks and the memory of what might have been. Yet during those same years, while working on the horse, Leonardo also created one of his most famous paintings, the work that would define his reputation for centuries to come. In the refectory of the convent of Santa Maria del Grazie, on a wall above where the monks took their meals, Leonardo painted the Last Supper. The commission came from Ludovico himself, who was renovating the church and wanted its dining hall decorated with a scene appropriate to its function. The subject was traditional Christ's final meal with his disciples, the moment when he announced that one of them would betray him. But Leonardo's treatment was revolutionary. He painted the scene as though it were happening in real time, in real space, as though the wall had dissolved and the viewer was looking directly into the room where the drama unfolded. The perspective was calculated precisely, with all the architectural lines converging on Christ's head at the center, making him the focal point despite being surrounded by 12 other figures. The apostles were arranged in groups of 3 on either side of Christ, each group forming its own subcomposition, each figure reacting to Christ's announcement with different emotions: shock, denial, anger, sorrow, confusion. Leonardo had captured not a single frozen moment, but a wave of reaction spreading through the room, each disciple's response revealing his individual character. He worked on the painting slowly, agonizingly slowly, using a technique that departed from traditional fresco methods. Instead of painting into wet plaster, which required working quickly before the plaster dried, Leonardo experimented with painting on dry plaster using a mixture of tempera and oil, which allowed him to work more gradually, to revise and refine as he went. This technique would prove disastrous for the painting's preservation. It began flaking and deteriorating within Leonardo's own lifetime, but it allowed him to achieve effects impossible with standard fresco. Subtle gradations of tone, delicate modeling of faces, a sense of atmosphere and light that seemed to emanate from the figures themselves. The monks of Santa Maria del Grazie must have found Leonardo's working methods perplexing, even maddening. He would sometimes arrive at the refectory at dawn and work all day without pause, climbing the scaffolding and painting with intense concentration, forgetting to eat or drink, lost in the work. Other times, days or even weeks would pass without him appearing at all. Then he would arrive suddenly, study the painting for an hour without touching it, make a few small adjustments, and leave again. The prior of the convent complained to Ludovico, frustrated by these irregular habits, by the way the project dragged on month after month with no clear end in sight. Ludovico summoned Leonardo to explain the delays. Leonardo's response, recorded by contemporary accounts, revealed his philosophy of creative work. He explained that men of genius sometimes accomplish more when they appear to be doing nothing, because their minds are working out problems, exploring possibilities, searching for solutions that are not obvious or easy. He said that he was struggling particularly with two figures, Christ and Judas. For Christ, he needed to convey a quality of divine wisdom and resignation that transcended ordinary human expression. For Judas, he needed to capture the face of someone capable of ultimate betrayal, a wickedness that went beyond mere criminality into moral darkness. He had been searching the streets of Milan for a model for Judas, studying the faces of criminals and outcasts, trying to find features that could embody treachery. Then, with a flash of wit that delighted Ludovico, Leonardo added that if he could not find a suitable model for Judas, he would be forced to use the face of the impatient prior who kept complaining about him. The joke diffused the tension, but it also pointed to a deeper truth about Leonardo's process. He could not simply manufacture paintings on demand, could not produce beauty through mechanical application of learned techniques. Each work required a period of gestation, of mental exploration, of waiting for the right solution to emerge. This made him frustrating to work with, unreliable by conventional standards, but it also meant that when he did complete something, it possessed a quality that transcended ordinary craftsmanship and entered the realm of revelation. The Last Supper, when finally revealed, justified every delay. It was immediately recognized as a masterpiece, perhaps the greatest narrative painting yet created. What Leonardo had achieved was not just technical brilliance, though the perspective, the composition, the handling of light were all masterful, but psychological depth. Each of the 12 apostles was an individual, a distinct personality reacting in character to the devastating announcement. Peter leaned forward aggressively, his hand gripping a knife, ready to defend his master. John slumped in sorrowful resignation, his hands folded, his expression one of heartbreak. Thomas raised a finger, questioning, needing to understand. Judas, seated with the others rather than isolated as in traditional depictions, recoiled slightly, his face shadowed, his hand clutching the purse containing his 30 pieces of silver. And at the center, surrounded by the chaos of human emotion, Christ sat in calm isolation, his hands spread in a gesture of acceptance, his face serene despite the knowledge of what was to come. Leonardo had achieved what he set out to do. He had painted divinity, or at least humanity's highest conception of it, a figure who existed in the same space as the apostles, but who seemed to inhabit a different dimension of being. The painting transformed the refectory wall into a window onto sacred history, making the distant past feel immediate and present, allowing viewers to witness the most pivotal moment in Christian narrative as though they were there in the room. But even as the Last Supper secured his reputation as a painter, Leonardo was increasingly drawn to other pursuits. His notebooks from the Milan years show an explosion of interests that went far beyond art. He designed elaborate irrigation systems, studying the behavior of water with scientific precision, trying to understand the principles that govern flow and erosion. He sketched flying machines, obsessed with the dream of human flight, analyzing bird anatomy and wing mechanics, imagining contraptions that might allow a person to soar like a bird. He drew weapons crossbows of unprecedented power, multi-barreled guns that could fire volleys of projectiles, armored vehicles that anticipated the tank by 4 centuries. He designed ideal cities with streets on multiple levels, separating pedestrian traffic from wagons and animals, incorporating sanitation systems that would prevent the spread of plague. Some of these designs were practical, commissioned by Ludovico or other patrons. Others were purely speculative, thought experiments exploring what might be possible. Leonardo was not always concerned with whether his inventions could actually be built with available materials and technology. He was interested in principles, in understanding the fundamental laws that governed mechanics, optics, hydraulics, aerodynamics. If the technology did not yet exist to realize his visions, that was a temporary limitation, not a fundamental barrier. Future generations, with better materials and more advanced manufacturing, would be able to implement what he could only sketch. His anatomical studies also continued and deepened. In Milan, he gained access to hospitals and was able to dissect human bodies with less restriction than in Florence. He performed these dissections himself, carefully opening the body layer by layer, drawing what he found with unprecedented accuracy. He was the first to correctly depict the human spine with its natural curves, the first to show the true structure of the heart's valves, the first to understand how the muscles of the eye move the eyeball in its socket. He injected wax into the chambers of the brain and then dissected it to understand the shape of the ventricles, trying to locate where consciousness resided, where the soul might connect to the body. These studies were dangerous, not just because of the disease risk from handling corpses, but because dissection was viewed with suspicion by religious authorities. The church taught that the body was sacred, that it would be resurrected at the end of time, and that cutting it apart was a kind of desecration. Leonardo had to be discreet, conducting his dissections at night, in cold weather when decomposition was slower, working quickly before the authorities could discover what he was doing. Yet he persisted, driven by a need to understand that overrode any concern for propriety or safety. The human body was the most complex and beautiful machine he had ever encountered, and he would not rest until he had mapped every part of it, understood every mechanism. Yet for all his scientific investigations, for all his engineering projects and theatrical designs, Leonardo never abandoned painting entirely. It was painting that paid him, painting that secured his reputation, painting that patrons actually commissioned and expected to receive. The tension between what interested him intellectually and what was demanded of him professionally created a constant friction in his life. He wanted to be more than a painter, wanted to be recognized as a universal genius, a man whose insights spanned all domains of knowledge. But the world kept insisting he was primarily an artist, kept judging him by whether he delivered completed paintings on time. During the Milan years, he took on various portrait commissions, including one that would become almost as famous as The Last Supper. Cecilia Gallerani was the young mistress of Ludovico Sforza, a woman of considerable intelligence and education who hosted a literary salon and corresponded with prominent intellectuals. Ludovico commissioned Leonardo to paint her portrait, likely as a gift or token of affection. The result was Lady with an Ermine, a painting that revolutionized portraiture as thoroughly as The Last Supper had transformed narrative painting. Traditional portraits of the period showed subjects in strict profile or three-quarter view, posed formally, often stiff and expressionless. Leonardo painted Cecilia turning, her body angled one way while her head turned to look over her shoulder, as though someone had just called her name and she was responding to the sound. The pose created a sense of movement, of life caught in mid-motion rather than frozen for eternity. Her expression was alert, intelligent, engaged, not the bland pleasantness that characterized most female portraits, but something more complex, more individual. And cradled in her arms was an ermine, a small white weasel-like creature that was both a symbol of purity and a visual pun on her name. The Greek word for ermine is gale, echoing Gallerani. The painting demonstrated Leonardo's mastery of light and shadow, the technique that would later be called chiaroscuro. Cecilia's face emerged from darkness, illuminated by an invisible light source that caught the curve of her cheek, the bridge of her nose, the delicate structure of her hand holding the ermine. The background was dark, almost black, eliminating any distraction and focusing all attention on the figure. This use of dramatic lighting created psychological intensity, made the portrait feel intimate despite being a formal commission, suggested a private moment rather than a public presentation. But even as Leonardo was creating these masterworks, his reputation for incompletion was growing. The Duke of Milan commissioned paintings that were started and abandoned, designs for buildings that were never constructed, engineering projects that stalled in the planning stages. Leonardo would begin enthusiastically, work intensely for weeks or months, and then his attention would shift to something else, a new problem that seemed more interesting, a different challenge that called to him more urgently. His mind was not linear but associative, constantly making connections between seemingly unrelated phenomena, seeing patterns that led him away from his original task into new territories of investigation. This way of working produced extraordinary insights but finished fewer projects than it should have. In Leonardo's notebooks, there are detailed plans for a mechanical lion that could walk and open its chest to reveal Lily, for a self-propelled cart that anticipated the automobile, for a device to measure humidity, for a parabolic compass, for dozens of inventions that existed only on paper. Each represented genuine innovation, genuine brilliance. But most remained theoretical, never built, never tested, never refined through the iterative process of practical application. Leonardo was better at conceiving than at executing, more comfortable in the realm of possibility than in the messier work of realization. His contemporaries found this frustrating. To them, an unfinished painting was a broken promise, a design never built was wasted effort. But Leonardo saw things differently. For him, the process of investigation was as valuable as the final product, perhaps more valuable. Understanding how something worked, why it behaved the way it did, what principles governed its operation, this knowledge was permanent, eternal, independent of whether it resulted in a completed painting or a constructed machine. The notebooks were not preliminary sketches on the way to something else. They were the work itself, the record of a mind engaged in the grandest project of all understanding the nature of reality. The years in Milan were productive, rich, filled with learning and creation. Leonardo was in his 30s and 40s, at the peak of his intellectual powers, surrounded by resources and given freedom to explore. He had assistants to help with technical work, patrons who valued him, a position of respect in one of Italy's most powerful courts. By conventional measures, he was successful, famous, well compensated, sought after. Yet there was always a sense of restlessness about him, a feeling that he was searching for something he could not quite find, that no single project or place could contain the vastness of his interests. And then, in 1499, everything changed. The political situation that had sustained Leonardo's comfortable position collapsed suddenly and completely. Charles VIII of France, claiming hereditary rights to Milan, invaded with a powerful army. Ludovico Sforza, for all his cunning and political maneuvering, could not withstand the French military machine. He fled the city, tried to mount a counterattack, was captured and imprisoned in France, where he would die 8 years later in a dungeon. The Sforza dynasty, which had ruled Milan for half a century, ended in a matter of months. And Leonardo, who had spent nearly 18 years in Ludovico's service, suddenly found himself without a patron, without security, without a clear future. The French occupation of Milan was chaotic. French soldiers looted palaces, destroyed property, and, as mentioned earlier, used Leonardo's clay model of the Great Horse for target practice until it collapsed in ruins. The enormous bronze equestrian monument, the project that was supposed to secure Leonardo's immortality, was reduced to broken clay fragments scattered on the ground. 18 years of work, thousands of hours of study and preparation. A masterpiece that had been complete in everything but the final casting, all of it destroyed in an afternoon by bored soldiers looking for entertainment. Leonardo packed what he could carry: notebooks, drawings, a few personal possessions, and left Milan in December of 1499. He was 47 years old, once again searching for a place that could accommodate his peculiar genius, once again leaving behind unfinished work and unfulfilled promises. He traveled to Venice briefly, offering his services as a military engineer, proposing schemes to defend the city from Turkish invasion. The Venetians listened politely but hired someone else. He moved on to Mantua, where he drew a portrait of Isabella d'Este, the brilliant and demanding marchioness who tried to commission a painting from him. He promised to paint her, but never did, though he kept the drawing for years, perhaps intending to complete it someday. By 1500, Leonardo was back in Florence, the city he had left 18 years earlier. But Florence had changed, and so had he. The city was no longer the confident republic of his youth, secure in its wealth and its artistic supremacy. It had endured political turmoil, the brief, intense rule of the reforming preacher Savonarola, who had denounced worldly luxury and art itself as sinful vanity, who had organized the infamous bonfire of the vanities, where paintings and books and beautiful objects were burned in a great pyre. Savonarola himself had eventually been executed, burned in the same square where he had burned so much else, but his influence lingered. Florence was more sober now, more anxious, aware of its vulnerability in a peninsula increasingly dominated by foreign powers, and Leonardo had changed too. He was no longer the promising young apprentice or even the successful court artist. He was a man approaching 50, famous, but also notorious for leaving projects unfinished, brilliant but difficult, respected but not entirely trusted. The Florence of 1500 already had its established artists. Botticelli was still working, though his style was falling out of fashion. Filippino Lippi was producing altarpieces. Perugino, Leonardo's old fellow apprentice, was receiving steady commissions. And there was new talent emerging, young artists who represented the next generation. Most notably, there was Michelangelo Buonarroti, 25 years old, who had recently returned from Rome, where he had carved the Pieta, and who was already being spoken of as a genius comparable to the ancients. The rivalry between Leonardo and Michelangelo was immediate and intense. Though more on Michelangelo's side than Leonardo's, they were opposites in almost every way. Leonardo was elegant, well-dressed, courteous, enigmatic, a man who moved through the world with grace and kept his deeper thoughts hidden. Michelangelo was rough, disheveled, often covered in marble dust, prone to explosive anger and bitter complaints. Leonardo's art was soft, subtle, concerned with capturing the nuances of light and expression. Michelangelo's was powerful, muscular, focused on the dramatic potential of the human body pushed to extremes of tension and emotion. Leonardo was interested in everything. Michelangelo cared only about sculpture and painting, dismissing Leonardo's scientific investigations as distractions from true art. They clashed publicly on at least one recorded occasion, an encounter in the streets of Florence, where Leonardo was asked to interpret a passage from Dante. Michelangelo happened to be passing by, and Leonardo suggested he could explain it. Michelangelo, taking this as condescension, shot back, "Explain it yourself, you who designed a bronze horse and couldn't cast it, and abandoned it to your shame." The insult cut deep because it was true. Leonardo had failed to complete the great monument, and everyone knew it. He walked away without responding, maintaining his composure, but the wound remained. Despite the personal friction, Leonardo found work in Florence. In 1502, he entered the service of Cesare Borgia, the notorious military commander and political schemer who was attempting to carve out a kingdom for himself in central Italy through a combination of military conquest and ruthless treachery. Borgia hired Leonardo as his chief military engineer, sending him to inspect fortifications, design defensive improvements, create maps of territories under Borgia's control. Leonardo traveled through the Romagna region, studying castles and walls, observing how armies moved, how sieges were conducted, how geography influenced military strategy. He produced maps of remarkable accuracy, showing terrain features, roads, water sources, all drawn from multiple perspectives to give a complete understanding of the landscape. But working for Cesare Borgia was morally complicated. Borgia was feared throughout Italy for his cruelty, his willingness to use any means to achieve his ends. He had probably murdered his own brother. He had certainly ordered the deaths of numerous rivals and former allies. Leonardo seems to have kept his distance emotionally, treating the work as a technical problem rather than a moral commitment. When Borgia's power collapsed in 1503 after the death of his father, Pope Alexander VI, Leonardo quietly ended the association and returned to Florence, apparently without regret. Back in Florence, Leonardo received two significant commissions almost simultaneously, both of them problematic in ways that would become characteristic. The first was a large altarpiece for the Servite friars, depicting the Virgin Mary with Saint Anne and the infant Christ. Leonardo created a preparatory cartoon, a full-scale drawing on paper, that was displayed publicly and caused a sensation. People lined up to see it, amazed by its composition, its tenderness, its psychological complexity. But Leonardo never completed the painting based on this cartoon. He started it, worked on it intermittently for years, but never brought it to a state he considered finished. The painting that now hangs in the Louvre, known as the Virgin and Child with Saint Anne, is beautiful but incomplete, with sections that are fully realized existing alongside areas that remain underworked, still showing the preparatory layers beneath. The second commission was even more ambitious and even more definitively unfinished. The Florentine government asked Leonardo to paint a massive mural in the new council hall of the Palazzo Vecchio, depicting the Battle of Anghiari, a Florentine military victory from 1440. The mural would cover an enormous wall, requiring hundreds of square feet of painted surface, showing cavalry combat with dozens of soldiers and horses in violent motion. It was exactly the kind of complex, challenging project that appealed to Leonardo. He accepted the commission and began preparing with his usual thoroughness, researching the historical battle, sketching compositions, studying horses in combat, working out the mechanics of men fighting on horseback. And in a remarkable twist of fate, Michelangelo was simultaneously commissioned to paint the opposite wall of the same room, depicting another Florentine victory, the Battle of Cascina. The two greatest artists of the age working in the same room on competing murals, each trying to prove his superiority over the other. It should have resulted in one of the greatest artistic achievements in history, a room that would have drawn visitors from across the world. Instead, it became a monument to incompletion. Leonardo approached the Battle of Anghiari with his characteristic ambition and his equally characteristic desire to experiment rather than follow established methods. He designed a composition centered on the struggle for a battle standard, with horses and riders locked in violent combat, their faces twisted in rage and effort, weapons clashing, the chaos of battle captured in a single frozen moment of maximum intensity. His preparatory drawings show an unprecedented understanding of both human and equine anatomy under extreme physical stress, muscles straining, tendons taut, expressions savage. This was not to be a sanitized, heroic depiction of war, but something rawer, more honest war as it actually was, brutal and terrible and consuming. But when it came time to actually paint the mural, Leonardo once again refused to use the standard technique. Fresco, the traditional method for wall painting, required working into wet plaster, painting quickly before the plaster dried and the chemical bond between pigment and wall could form. This technique was proven, reliable, used for centuries. But it did not allow for the subtle gradations of tone, the delicate modeling, the atmospheric effects that Leonardo wanted to achieve. So he experimented with an alternative method based on descriptions he had read in ancient texts, using oil-based paints applied to a specially prepared wall surface that would allow him to work slowly, to revise, to achieve the effects impossible with standard fresco. The experiment was a disaster. Leonardo began painting in June 1505, working from scaffolding in the vast council hall. But almost immediately, problems emerged. The paint did not adhere properly to the wall. Colors began to run, blending together in unintended ways. The surface remained tacky, refusing to dry properly. Leonardo tried to solve the problem by setting up braziers filled with hot coals beneath the painting, hoping that heat would accelerate the drying process. It may have worked for the lower portions of the mural, but the upper sections were too far from the heat source. The paint continued to deteriorate, and Leonardo, recognizing that the technical problems were insurmountable, abandoned the project after completing only a central section. The city of Florence was left with a partially painted wall and an artist who had once again failed to deliver what he had promised. Michelangelo, meanwhile, had completed his preparatory cartoon for the Battle of Cascina, and it was magnificent. A complex composition showing Florentine soldiers caught by surprise while bathing, scrambling from the water to defend against an attack, their nude bodies captured in dynamic poses that demonstrated Michelangelo's supreme mastery of human anatomy. But Michelangelo was then summoned to Rome by Pope Julius II, who wanted him to design and carve a massive tomb, and the Battle of Cascina was never painted either. Both murals remained unfinished, and eventually both cartoons were lost or destroyed. Later, artists covered the walls with new paintings, and one of the most anticipated artistic competitions in history ended without either masterpiece being completed. These failures might have destroyed a lesser reputation, but Leonardo's fame was by now built on more than completed works. He was recognized as a genius, as someone operating on a different level from ordinary artists, and if his methods were unconventional, if he left more projects unfinished than finished, this was accepted as part of the price of that genius. Younger artists studied his preparatory drawings as intensely as they would have studied completed paintings, recognizing that even his sketches contained insights they could learn from. His ideas about proportion, about composition, about the relationship between art and science, these circulated through the artistic community, influencing painters and sculptors who would never meet him personally. And during these restless years, moving between Florence and Milan and various smaller courts, Leonardo was working on something that would eventually eclipse all his other achievements, something he carried with him constantly, refining endlessly, never quite finishing but bringing ever closer to perfection. It was a portrait of a Florentine merchant's wife, a woman named Lisa Gherardini, known to history as the Mona Lisa. He had begun it around 1503, possibly as a commission, though the details are unclear, and he would continue working on it for the rest of his life, adding layers of translucent glaze so thin they were almost invisible individually, but which accumulated into depth and luminosity that seemed almost supernatural. The painting was small, just 30 inches tall, showing a woman seated in three-quarter view against a landscape background. Everything about it seemed simple, even ordinary. But there was something in the woman's expression, in the slight smile that seemed to shift depending on the viewer's angle, in the eyes that followed you no matter where you stood, in the sense of a complete human being present behind the painted surface. Leonardo was applying everything he had learned about light, about shadow, about the structure of the human face, about the way emotion manifested in subtle muscular shifts. He was painting not just appearance, but consciousness itself, not just a woman, but the mystery of what it meant to be human. He would never sell this painting, never deliver it to whoever might have originally commissioned it. It became his companion, his meditation, his endless refinement. When he traveled, the Mona Lisa traveled with him, carefully wrapped and protected. When he was given time in solitude, he would add another layer, another subtle adjustment, always seeing something that could be improved, something not quite perfect. The painting became both a masterpiece and an obsession, something he could never finish because finishing would mean accepting that he had achieved everything possible. And for Leonardo, there was always more to discover, always a finer level of perfection just beyond reach. The wandering years were productive but exhausting. Leonardo was no longer young, no longer able to absorb the constant disruption and uncertainty with the resilience of his earlier years. He was in his 50s, and the endless movement from court to court, patron to patron, city to city, took its toll. He wanted security, respect, the freedom to work without constant financial pressure. But Italy was becoming increasingly unstable, torn by wars between French and Spanish forces fighting for control of the peninsula, by conflicts between the papacy and various secular powers, by the endless maneuvering of city-states trying to survive in a dangerous world. In 1513, Leonardo moved to Rome, hoping that the new pope, Leo X, a member of the Medici family and himself a patron of the arts, would provide employment. But Rome was now Michelangelo's city and Raphael's city, both younger, both more reliably productive, both better suited to the grand decorative projects the papacy favored. Leonardo was given a workshop in the Vatican Palace, a pension, but no major commissions. He conducted experiments with mirrors and optics, designed improvements for draining the Pontine marshes, continued his anatomical studies. But he was, in many ways, marginal respected as a legendary figure from an earlier era, but not central to the vital artistic production happening around him. The wandering genius was growing tired of wandering. He had created masterpieces that would endure forever, had filled thousands of pages with insights that anticipated modern science, had lived a life of extraordinary richness and variety. But he had also left a trail of unfinished projects, broken promises, disappointed patrons. His mind had taken him everywhere, had explored every realm of human knowledge, but it had also prevented him from the sustained focus required to complete most of what he began. He was perpetually between art and science, between cities and patrons, between the vision in his mind and the imperfect reality of execution. And now, approaching old age, he was ready for something he had never really had: rest. Chapter 4: The Notebooks of Eternity. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a room when genius works alone. It is not empty silence, but full silence, thick with concentration, with the sound of a pen scratching across paper, with the occasional pause as a mind searches for the right word, the precise line, the exact angle that will capture an idea before it escapes. In such silence, Leonardo da Vinci spent thousands of hours of his life, hunched over his notebooks, writing backward in his mirror script, drawing with quick, confident strokes, building an archive of thought that would outlast every painting he ever created. These notebooks were never meant for publication, never intended as formal treatises to be read by scholars and dignitaries. They were private spaces, workshops of the mind, where Leonardo could think freely without the constraints of patronage or convention, where he could follow his curiosity wherever it led without having to justify the journey. The notebooks began simply as practical tools. Every artist kept sketchbooks, places to record ideas, to work out compositions, to practice drawing difficult subjects. But Leonardo's notebooks evolved into something far more comprehensive, far stranger and more ambitious. They became encyclopedias of everything that interested him, which meant they became encyclopedias of nearly everything. He did not organize them by subject or chronology. A single page might contain anatomical drawings alongside geometric theorems, notes about painting techniques next to observations about water flow, a sketch of a flying machine adjacent to a list of household expenses. The notebooks reflected the way his mind actually worked, not in neat categories, but in associative leaps, constantly making connections between seemingly unrelated phenomena, seeing patterns that linked the movement of water to the growth of hair, the flight of birds to the design of fortifications, the structure of the human heart to the mechanics of hydraulic pumps. Over the course of his life, Leonardo filled somewhere between 13,000 and 20,000 pages, covering them with his distinctive left-handed mirror writing and thousands upon thousands of drawings. Many of these pages have been lost, scattered, sold, destroyed, misplaced over the centuries since his death. What survives, about 7,000 pages in various collections around the world, represents perhaps half or less of his total output. Yet even this fraction is staggering in its scope and depth. No single person in the Renaissance, perhaps no single person in history, left behind such a comprehensive record of an individual mind exploring the world in all its complexity. The notebooks are Leonardo's truest legacy, more intimate and more revealing than any of his paintings, a portrait of genius in its raw, unfiltered state. He wrote in Italian rather than Latin, which was unusual for someone dealing with scientific and philosophical subjects. Latin was the language of scholarship, the universal tongue that educated people across Europe could read and understand. Writing in Italian meant his work would be accessible to fewer people, particularly outside Italy. But Leonardo had never received a formal classical education, had never mastered Latin to the degree that would have allowed him to write with ease and precision. He referred to himself as an unlettered man, someone who had not been trained in the traditional curriculum of grammar, rhetoric, and classical texts. But he wore this designation with a certain pride, arguing that his lack of formal education had actually been an advantage, allowing him to approach the world directly through observation rather than through the distorting lens of inherited authority. Though I have no power to quote from authors as they have, he wrote in one of his notebooks, I shall rely on a far more worthy thing on experience, the mistress of their masters. They strut about puffed up and pompous, dressed and decorated not with their own labors, but with those of others, and they will not even allow me my own. And if they despise me, who am an inventor, how much more should they be blamed who are not inventors, but trumpeters and reciters of the works of others? This was Leonardo's manifesto, his declaration of independence from the academic establishment. He would learn not from books, but from the world itself, and his notebooks would be the record of that learning. The pages themselves are beautiful objects, even when the content is purely technical. Leonardo's handwriting, though mirror reversed, is clear and elegant, with occasional flourishes that suggest his training as an artist extended even to the formation of letters. His drawings range from quick, almost careless sketches that capture the essence of an idea in a few strokes to elaborate, fully rendered images that are works of art in themselves. He used different media depending on what he was trying to achieve, pen and ink for most of his notes and diagrams, chalk or charcoal for softer effects, occasionally wash or watercolor for studies that required tonal variation. The drawings are not merely illustrations of the text or decorative additions. They are integral to his thinking, ways of exploring ideas that could not be adequately expressed in words alone. Consider his studies of water, which occupy hundreds of pages across multiple notebooks. Leonardo was obsessed with water, its movement, its power, its behavior under different conditions. He drew water flowing from pipes, falling in cascades, forming whirlpools and eddies, striking obstacles and dividing around them. He studied waves in lakes and oceans, observing how they propagated, how they reflected and refracted, how they interacted with each other. He watched rain falling, fountains splashing, rivers flooding, and in each phenomenon he saw both uniqueness and universal principle. Water, he believed, was one of the four fundamental elements, and understanding it meant understanding a basic building block of reality itself. But his interest was not purely theoretical. Water had practical importance for irrigation, for power, for transportation, for defense. Leonardo designed canal systems, water-powered mills, devices for draining marshes and controlling floods. He proposed schemes to make rivers navigable, to redirect their courses, to harness their energy for human purposes. Yet even as he worked on these engineering problems, he was also exploring water aesthetically, seeing in its movements a kind of beauty that connected to the broader patterns of nature. He compared the curls of water in a vortex to the curls of human hair, finding the same spiral pattern repeating at different scales. This was characteristic of Leonardo's approach, refusing to separate the practical from the beautiful, the scientific from the artistic, seeing instead a unified reality where the same principles operated everywhere. His anatomical studies, which occupy some of the most remarkable pages in all the notebooks, began with artistic necessity, but evolved into something approaching modern medical science. Every artist needed to understand the human body well enough to depict it convincingly, but most were content with superficial knowledge, learning the standard proportions, memorizing conventional ways of rendering muscles and gestures, studying a few Ikaruchi figures that showed the major muscle groups. Leonardo demanded deeper understanding. He wanted to know not just what the body looked like, but how it worked, what mechanisms produced movement, what structures allowed for the miracle of life itself. He dissected at least 30 human corpses over the course of his life, most of them at the hospital of Santa Maria Nuova in Florence, though he also gained access to bodies in Milan and Rome. The work was difficult, unpleasant, often dangerous. Bodies decomposed rapidly, especially in warm weather, and the smell was overwhelming. Disease was a constant risk: infections, parasites, the mysterious miasmas that were thought to cause plague. Working by candlelight in cold rooms, often alone, Leonardo opened bodies layer by layer, peeling back skin to expose muscle, moving muscle aside to reveal bone, tracing the pathways of blood vessels and nerves, following the branching structures of lungs and the complex architecture of the heart. And he drew everything with meticulous precision. His anatomical drawings are not stylized or simplified. They are accurate representations of what he actually saw, rendered with such clarity that modern medical students can still use them to learn anatomy. He drew the bones from multiple angles, understanding that a single view could not capture their three-dimensional complexity. He showed muscles in isolation and in relationship to each other, demonstrating how they attached to bone, how they worked in opposing pairs to produce movement. He traced the nervous system, following the delicate threads that connected brain to body, trying to understand how sensation traveled, how the will translated into action. Some of his discoveries were unprecedented. He was the first to correctly describe the curvature of the spine, showing its natural S-shape rather than the straight column depicted in earlier anatomical texts. He accurately drew the heart's chambers and valves. Though he did not quite grasp the full circulatory system, that insight would have to wait for William Harvey more than a century later. He studied the eye in extraordinary detail, dissecting it layer by layer, trying to understand how light entered, how the lens focused, how images formed. He was convinced that vision was the supreme sense, the primary way humans engaged with reality, and he wanted to understand its mechanism completely. His studies extended to reproduction and embryology. He dissected pregnant women who had died, drawing the fetus in the womb with the umbilical cord connecting it to the placenta, showing the position of the baby, the protective membranes surrounding it. These drawings are both scientifically accurate and strangely moving, capturing the vulnerability of nascent life, the extraordinary complexity of the process by which one human being grows inside another. Leonardo approached the subject with his characteristic lack of squeamishness, but also with evident wonder, seeing in reproduction one of nature's most remarkable achievements. Yet his anatomical work remained almost entirely private during his lifetime. He planned to publish a comprehensive treatise on human anatomy, organizing his scattered observations into a systematic presentation that would revolutionize medical knowledge. But like so many of his projects, this one was never completed. The drawings remained in his notebooks, occasionally shown to friends or students, but not widely circulated, not transformed into the printed books that would have made them influential. It would be centuries before most of his anatomical discoveries were rediscovered by others and given credit to the later investigators who documented them in published form. The same pattern characterized his mechanical inventions, which fill countless pages of the notebooks with devices both practical and fantastical. Leonardo lived in an age when mechanical power was still limited to human and animal muscle, to water wheels and windmills, to the potential energy stored in wound springs and counterweights. The age of steam was still centuries away, and electrical power was undreamed of. Yet within these constraints, Leonardo imagined an astonishing array of machines, some of which would not be built until the 20th century. He designed a helicopter, or at least a flying screw, a device with a spiral blade that would, in theory, compress air and lift itself upward when rotated rapidly. The design was aerodynamically flawed and could not have worked with available materials and power sources, but the principle was sound, anticipating the actual helicopter by more than 400 years. He sketched parachutes, showing a pyramid-shaped canopy made of linen that would allow a person to descend safely from a great height. This design was tested in the year 2000 using materials available in Leonardo's time, and it worked perfectly, supporting a man's weight and bringing him safely to Earth. He drew a self-propelled cart, powered by springs that would be wound up and then released to drive the wheels, essentially an early automobile, lacking only a suitable engine. He designed a tank, an armored vehicle covered with metal plates and bristling with guns, propelled from inside by men turning cranks. He sketched a diving suit, complete with a breathing tube that would extend to the surface, allowing a person to walk on the bottom of a lake or harbor. He designed a mechanical knight, a suit of armor with internal mechanisms that would allow it to move its limbs, sit, stand, and move its head. A robot centuries before the word existed. Some of these inventions were commissioned by patrons who needed military or engineering solutions. Others were pure speculation, thought experiments exploring what might be possible. Leonardo understood that many of his designs could not be built with existing technology. Materials were not strong enough, power sources not sufficient, manufacturing techniques not precise enough. But he drew them anyway, understanding that ideas outlive their immediate context, that a design unfeasible in 1500 might become practical in 1900 or 2000. He was thinking not just for his own time but for the future, leaving behind a catalog of possibilities for generations that would possess the means to realize them. Interspersed among the scientific observations and mechanical designs were pages of a different character reflections on art, on beauty, on the principles that governed visual perception and aesthetic response. Leonardo thought deeply about what made one image compelling and another forgettable, what allowed a painting to transcend mere representation and achieve something approaching truth. He wrote extensively about proportion, about the mathematical relationships that produced harmony in both natural forms and human creations. He analyzed the golden ratio, the spiral patterns found in shells and flowers, the geometry underlying pleasing compositions. But he also understood that beauty could not be reduced entirely to mathematics, that there was something ineffable about it, something that appealed to the emotions and the spirit rather than just to rational calculation. He developed theories about how painters should approach their work, advice that reflected his own methods and obsessions. The painter who draws by practice and judgment of the eye without the use of reason, he wrote, is like the mirror which copies everything placed in front of it without knowledge of the same. This was Leonardo's fundamental conviction that art required understanding, not just skill. A painter needed to know anatomy, perspective, optics, the behavior of light and shadow, the properties of color, and how they interacted. Without this knowledge, the artist was merely copying surfaces without comprehending the underlying reality. He wrote about atmosphere, about the way air itself affected what we see. He noted that distant objects appeared bluer and less distinct than near ones, that colors shifted and faded with distance, that outlines softened and details disappeared. This phenomenon, which he called aerial perspective or perspective of atmosphere, became one of his signature techniques, allowing him to create depth and space in paintings through subtle gradations of color and clarity rather than merely through geometric perspective. The mysterious, misty landscapes in the backgrounds of the Mona Lisa and other paintings are applications of this principle, using atmosphere to suggest infinite distance to create a sense of world extending beyond the frame. He filled pages with notes about light, how it traveled, how it reflected, how it revealed form and texture. He understood that shadows were not simply black, but contained colors reflected from surrounding objects. He observed that the transition from light to shadow was gradual rather than abrupt, that there was a zone of half shadow where light and darkness negotiated. He studied the different qualities of light, the hard, bright light of midday versus the soft, warm light of dawn and dusk, the diffused light on an overcast day versus the dramatic contrasts created by candlelight. Each type of light revealed the world differently, created different moods, suggested different truths. His theories about painting extended to psychological and narrative dimensions. He advised artists to study gestures, expressions, the ways people moved and held their bodies, because these revealed character and emotion more reliably than faces alone. He recommended observing people in unguarded moments in taverns and markets, at celebrations and funerals, to see how they really behaved rather than how they posed. He understood that a painting told a story not just through its explicit subject, but through 1,000 small details: the tilt of a head, the position of a hand, the direction of a gaze. Every element of the composition should contribute to a unified effect, should guide the viewer's attention and emotion toward the intended response. Yet for all his theorizing, Leonardo also recognized the limitations of rules and systems. "Art is never finished, only abandoned," he wrote, capturing the essential tension of creative work, the gap between vision and execution, the way perfection remains always slightly out of reach. He knew from his own experience that the image in the mind never quite translated to the image on the panel, that the act of creation involved compromise, adaptation, acceptance of imperfection. This was perhaps why he found it so difficult to complete projects, why he could work on a single painting for years without being satisfied. He could see the flaws that others could not, could perceive the distance between what he had achieved and what he had imagined. The notebooks also contained more personal material, though Leonardo was generally private about his inner life. There were lists of expenses, records of money lent and borrowed, reminders to buy clothing or household items. There were notes about his assistants and students, who was learning what, who needed correction, who showed promise. There were occasional complaints about patrons who did not pay on time, about the difficulty of obtaining materials, about the interruptions that prevented sustained work. And scattered throughout were fables and allegories, short moral tales in the style popular during the Renaissance, many of them featuring animals or natural phenomena as characters. These fables reveal a mind that thought in metaphors, that saw moral and philosophical significance in everyday observations. The water you touch in a river is the last of that which has passed and the first of that which is coming, he wrote in one characteristic reflection. Thus it is with time present. Such observations blend poetry with philosophy, aesthetic sensitivity with conceptual insight. They suggest that for Leonardo, there was no hard boundary between the objective world and subjective experience, between scientific fact and poetic truth. Everything connected, everything meant something beyond itself. He wrote about his method of generating ideas, offering advice that reveals his own creative process. He recommended staring at stained walls, at clouds, at ashes in a fireplace, looking at random, ambiguous patterns until images began to emerge, until the mind imposed form on formlessness. This technique, which anticipates modern psychological concepts about perception and creativity, worked for Leonardo because his mind was already full of stored images and knowledge. When he looked at a stained wall, he saw potential landscapes, figures, compositions, because he had trained his eye to see pattern and structure everywhere. The randomness provided stimulus, but the vision came from within. His notebooks also documented his failures, though usually indirectly. There are pages of calculations that lead nowhere, designs that were abandoned partway through, observations that were never developed into theories. There are notes reminding himself to return to certain questions, to investigate particular phenomena more thoroughly, reminders that suggest intentions never fulfilled. The notebooks are not a polished presentation of completed knowledge, but a working record of investigation in progress, full of dead ends and unfinished thoughts, questions raised but not answered, problems identified but not solved. Among the most striking pages in the notebooks are those devoted to the dream of human flight, a subject that obsessed Leonardo throughout his life. He was convinced that humans could fly, that the barrier was not fundamental but merely technical, a problem waiting to be solved through sufficient understanding and clever engineering. He watched birds with the intensity of a scientist conducting controlled experiments, noting every detail of their movement, every adjustment of wing and tail, every shift of weight that allowed them to soar, glide, turn, dive, hover. He dissected birds to understand their anatomy, studying the structure of their wings, the lightness of their bones, the powerful muscles that drove flight. He filled page after page with wing designs, exploring different mechanisms for flapping, different shapes and angles, different materials that might provide both strength and lightness. He calculated the surface area needed to support a human's weight, estimating the relationship between wing size and lifting capacity. He designed ornithopters machines with flapping wings that would theoretically allow a person to fly like a bird. Some designs had the pilot lying prone, operating the wings with both arms and legs through an elaborate system of cables and pulleys. Others positioned the pilot upright, with the wings attached to a harness system. All were impractical, doomed to fail because Leonardo did not understand that birds had not just different anatomy, but different physiology, faster metabolisms, more efficient respiratory systems, structural adaptations that allowed them to generate the power needed for sustained flight. But his failure to achieve human flight in his lifetime did not invalidate his approach. He was asking the right questions, making the right observations, even if he lacked the materials and knowledge to reach the right conclusions. His studies of bird flight, of air currents, of the principles of lift and drag were genuine contributions to understanding aerodynamics. When humans finally did achieve powered flight 4 centuries later, they did so by building on foundations that Leonardo had begun to lay, even if his specific designs could not work. There was something poignant about Leonardo's obsession with flight, something that revealed his deepest longings. Flight represented freedom, transcendence, escape from earthly limitations. A man who spent his life constrained by the demands of patrons, by the imperfections of materials, by the gap between vision and execution, naturally dreamed of soaring above it all, of moving through space with the effortless grace of a swallow. Flight was the ultimate problem, the ultimate challenge, and if he could solve it, he would have achieved something no one had ever accomplished, would have pushed human capability into a realm previously reserved for birds and angels and imagination. The notebooks also contained extensive studies of geology, another subject that fascinated Leonardo. He observed rock formations, noting how layers were deposited, how erosion carved valleys and shaped mountains, how rivers carried sediment and gradually transformed landscapes. He found fossilized shells on mountaintops, far from any ocean, and reasoned that these areas must once have been underwater, that the Earth's surface changed dramatically over immense periods of time. This conclusion contradicted the biblical account of a static Earth created in 6 days only a few thousand years earlier, though Leonardo, always cautious about religious controversy, never explicitly challenged church doctrine. He simply recorded what he observed and drew logical conclusions, leaving others to reconcile observation with theology. He studied clouds and weather, trying to understand what caused rain, wind, storms. He observed the moon, noting that its surface appeared uneven, marked with darker and lighter regions that suggested mountains and valleys rather than a perfect sphere. He calculated the size of the moon and its distance from Earth, though his methods and results were imprecise compared to modern measurements. He was curious about everything in the natural world, convinced that it all operated according to rational principles that patient observation could uncover. Plants received his attention too. He drew trees in exquisite detail, studying the branching patterns, the way smaller branches divided from larger ones in predictable ratios, the distribution of leaves to maximize sunlight exposure. He observed that plant growth followed mathematical patterns, that the arrangement of leaves around a stem, the spiral of seeds in a sunflower head, the branching of roots underground, all reflected underlying geometric principles. Nature, he believed, was fundamentally mathematical, governed by ratios and proportions that appeared at every scale from the smallest flower to the largest landscape. His botanical drawings were not just scientific documentation, but works of art, capturing the delicate structure of flowers, the texture of bark, the graceful curves of stems and leaves. He saw no conflict between scientific accuracy and aesthetic beauty. They were aspects of the same truth, different ways of honoring the perfection inherent in natural forms. When he painted plants in his paintings, they were botanically accurate because he had studied them thoroughly, had understood their structure, had seen them as complete organisms rather than merely as decorative elements. Throughout the notebooks, certain themes recur, certain preoccupations that reveal the deeper patterns of Leonardo's thought. One was the relationship between microcosm and macrocosm, the idea that the same principles operated at different scales, that understanding the small could illuminate the large and vice versa. He compared the human body to the earth, seeing parallels between blood circulation and rivers, between bones and rocks, between breathing and the cycle of evaporation and rain. This was not merely poetic metaphor, but a genuine philosophical conviction that the universe was unified, that all phenomena were manifestations of underlying laws that operated everywhere. Another recurring theme was the primacy of experience over authority. Leonardo returned again and again and again to the argument that observation was superior to inherited knowledge, that the eye was a more reliable guide than ancient texts. Anyone who argues by referring to authority is not using his mind but his memory, he wrote, dismissing the scholastic method that dominated Renaissance learning. He positioned himself as a different kind of intellectual, one who built knowledge from the ground up through direct encounter with reality rather than by interpreting what previous generations had written. Yet there was also loneliness in the notebooks, a sense of isolation that came from being so far ahead of his time. Leonardo was making discoveries that no one else would make for centuries, asking questions that his contemporaries could not understand, pursuing investigations that seemed pointless or heretical to those around him. He had no community of fellow scientists to share his findings with, no journals to publish in, no institutions that could validate or build upon his work. His notebooks were conversations with himself, with the future, with anyone who might eventually find them and understand what he had been trying to say. He knew, on some level, that most of his scientific work would be lost or ignored, that he was not positioned to have the immediate impact that publication and institutional recognition would provide. But he could not stop investigating, could not suppress the curiosity that drove him to understand everything. The notebooks were compulsive, necessary, the only way he could make sense of the world and his place in it. They were his true masterpieces, more comprehensive and more revealing than any painting, a record of human intelligence operating at its highest level, transforming observation into insight, experience into wisdom. As the notebooks accumulated over decades, they became a kind of parallel autobiography, one that told Leonardo's story not through external events, but through the evolution of his thinking. Early pages show an artist learning to see, practicing proportions, studying perspective, mastering the technical foundations of his craft. Later pages reveal a mind expanding beyond art into territory that would eventually be called science, though that distinction would have meant nothing to Leonardo, who saw observation and creation as parts of a unified enterprise. The notebooks chart the journey of someone who began as a craftsman and became a philosopher, who started by asking how to paint better and ended by questioning the fundamental nature of reality. There are pages that seem almost modern in their approach, anticipating methods and conclusions that would not be formally established until centuries later. He wrote about the principle of inertia, noting that an object in motion would continue moving unless something stopped it, a concept that Newton would formalize 2 centuries later as the first law of motion. He understood that sound traveled in waves, that it took time to cover distance, which was why you saw lightning before you heard thunder. He recognized that the Earth was not the center of the universe, but merely one body among many, though he was careful not to state this too explicitly, aware that such claims could bring accusations of heresy. He experimented with optics, building camera obscuras dark chambers with a small opening that projected an inverted image of the outside world onto an interior wall. He studied these projections carefully, trying to understand how light traveled, how images formed, how the eye itself might work like such a chamber, with light entering through the pupil and projecting onto the retina. He was working toward a comprehensive theory of vision, one that would explain not just the mechanics of seeing, but the relationship between the physical eye and the conscious mind that interpreted what the eye perceived. His investigations into mathematics grew more sophisticated as he aged. He corresponded with mathematicians, studied Euclid and other classical geometers, worked through problems involving proportion and ratio. He became particularly interested in the squaring of the circle, the ancient puzzle of constructing a square with the same area as a given circle, using only compass and straightedge. This problem was actually impossible, as would be proven mathematically much later, but Leonardo did not know that, and he spent countless hours exploring different approaches, filling pages with diagrams and calculations that spiraled toward solutions that always remained just out of reach. There was something Sisyphean about many of his investigations, a quality of endless striving toward goals that could not quite be attained. But Leonardo seemed to find satisfaction in the pursuit itself, in the process of investigation rather than in definitive conclusions. He was comfortable with uncertainty, with questions that had no clear answers, with mysteries that deepened rather than resolved upon examination. This tolerance for ambiguity was unusual in an age that valued certainty, that looked to ancient authorities for definitive answers, that treated inherited wisdom as more reliable than new observation. The notebooks also contained Leonardo's philosophical reflections, though these were fragmentary and unsystematic, scattered among technical observations like gems in gravel. He thought about time, about memory, about consciousness. He wondered about the nature of the soul, whether it was located in a specific part of the body or distributed throughout, whether it survived death or perished with the flesh. He was skeptical of supernatural claims, of miracles and prophecies. Yet he also recognized that the natural world contained wonders enough, that existence itself was miraculous, regardless of whether divine intervention was required to explain it. He wrote about human nature, about the gap between how people presented themselves and who they really were. He was a keen observer of character, able to read personality in faces and gestures, to see through pretense and performance to the truth beneath. This ability served him as a painter, allowing him to capture psychological complexity in his portraits, but it also made him somewhat cynical about human motives and behavior. He saw how ambition corrupted, how people betrayed each other for advantage, how the powerful exploited the weak. The courts he served were full of intrigue and manipulation, and Leonardo, though dependent on patrons for survival, maintained an emotional distance from their machinations. Yet he was not misanthropic. His notebooks reveal affection for certain students and colleagues, concern for the suffering of others, pleasure in beauty and friendship. He loved animals, was reportedly vegetarian because he could not bear to cause suffering to creatures he considered sentient and worthy of consideration. He bought caged birds in markets just to release them, delighting in watching them fly to freedom. This tenderness coexisted with his willingness to dissect corpses and conduct experiments that modern ethics would question, a contradiction that Leonardo himself probably did not recognize as such. He was a man of his time in some ways, far ahead of it in others, inconsistent in the manner that most humans are inconsistent. As he aged, the notebooks became more philosophical. less concerned with specific technical problems and more engaged with larger questions. He reflected on mortality, on the brevity of life, on the way time eroded everything eventually. He wrote about the transience of beauty, how even the most perfect face aged and decayed, how all human creations eventually crumbled into dust. Yet he also believed that knowledge could transcend mortality, that ideas could outlive the bodies that conceived them. That understanding, once achieved, became part of the permanent human inheritance. His notebooks were his bid for immortality, his attempt to preserve what he had learned so that others could build upon it. He imagined readers in the future, people who would find his notebooks and understand what he had been attempting, who would have the knowledge and tools to complete what he had begun. He was right about this, though it took longer than he might have hoped. For centuries after his death, the notebooks were scattered, some lost, others locked away in private collections, still others misunderstood by people who could not recognize their significance. Francesco Melzi, Leonardo's devoted pupil and heir, preserved them carefully after his master's death, recognizing their value even if he could not fully comprehend their scope. But after Melzi died, the notebooks were divided among heirs, sold to collectors, dispersed across Europe. Some were rediscovered in the 19th century when scholars finally began to appreciate what Leonardo had achieved, to recognize him as not just a great artist, but a pioneering scientist, an inventor whose vision had anticipated modern technology, a thinker who had asked fundamental questions about the nature of reality. The notebooks were transcribed, translated, analyzed, published in scholarly editions. Each new discovery revealed more of Leonardo's genius, more evidence of how far ahead of his time he had been. The man who had worked in isolation, whose scientific investigations had no immediate impact on the development of knowledge, was finally recognized as a founder of modern empirical science, someone who had shown that careful observation combined with mathematical reasoning could unlock nature's secrets. The notebooks became famous, studied by artists and scientists alike, admired not just for their content, but for their aesthetic beauty, for the way Leonardo's drawings captured both accuracy and grace, for the elegance of his handwriting even in mirror script. They confirmed what the paintings had suggested, that this was a mind unlike any other, capacious and curious, rigorous and imaginative, capable of moving seamlessly between art and science, between particular observations and universal principles, between the immediate present and the distant future. Chapter 5. The final masterpiece, the Mona Lisa. There are paintings that capture a moment, and then there is the painting that captures eternity. In a workshop in Florence, sometime around 1503, Leonardo da Vinci began work on a portrait that would become the most famous painting in the history of art. An image so familiar that it has transcended art itself and entered the realm of universal symbol. She sits before us with that slight, enigmatic smile, her hands folded calmly, her gaze following us no matter where we stand. And for more than 500 years, people have looked at her and wondered, what is she thinking? What does that smile mean? Who is she really, beneath the layers of paint and varnish and accumulated mythology? The woman was Lisa Gardini, born in Florence in 1479 to a family of modest means. She married Francesco del Giocondo, a wealthy silk merchant, when she was 15 years old, becoming his third wife after his first two had died. By the time Leonardo began her portrait, she was about 24, the mother of several children, living a comfortable but unremarkable life as a merchant's wife in Renaissance Florence. She was not famous, not powerful, not connected to the great political or artistic events of her time. She was simply a woman, one among thousands in the city, and nothing about her circumstances suggested that her face would become the most recognized image in human history. Why Leonardo chose to paint her, or how the commission came about, remains somewhat mysterious. The most commonly accepted story is that Francesco del Giocondo commissioned the portrait around 1503, possibly to commemorate the purchase of a new house or the birth of a child. Leonardo was back in Florence after years in Milan, working on various projects including the disastrous Battle of Anghiari mural, and he apparently accepted this relatively modest portrait commission among his grander undertakings. But if it began as a simple commercial transaction, paint a merchant's wife, deliver the finished portrait, receive payment, it did not remain simple for long. Leonardo approached the portrait with the same intensity he brought to everything, but also with something more. Something that suggested this was not merely another commission, but an opportunity to explore questions that had fascinated him throughout his career. How could paint on a wooden panel capture not just the appearance of a person, but their inner life, their consciousness, their soul? How could a two-dimensional image create the illusion not just of three-dimensional form, but of a living, thinking, feeling human being? These were questions he had pursued in every portrait he painted, but with Lisa Gherardini, he would push further than he had ever gone before. He began with the composition, which was deceptively simple. Lisa sits in a chair. We see only the arms of it, with her body angled slightly to the left, but her face turned toward the viewer. Her hands are folded, the right hand resting gently over the left, in a pose that suggests both relaxation and alertness, composure without stiffness. Behind her stretches a landscape, a strange, dreamlike vista of mountains and water and winding paths that seems to exist in some timeless realm rather than any specific location. The composition follows conventions that Leonardo had used before: the three-quarter view, the landscape background, the pyramidal arrangement of the figure, but he would refine and perfect these elements until they achieved a harmony that seemed inevitable, as though this was the only way the painting could possibly be arranged. He worked slowly, building up the image layer by layer in a technique that required extraordinary patience. The wooden panel had been carefully prepared, covered with multiple coats of gesso to create a smooth, bright surface. Over this, Leonardo applied a thin layer of oil paint, so thin it was almost transparent, establishing the basic composition and values. Then he waited for this layer to dry completely before applying the next one, another translucent glaze that would subtly modify the colors and tones beneath. And then another layer and another, each one requiring days or weeks to dry properly, each one adding depth and luminosity that could not be achieved through direct painting. This technique, which Leonardo had perfected over decades, created effects that seemed almost supernatural. Light did not just reflect off the surface of the painting, but seemed to emanate from within it, as though the paint itself were luminous. The flesh tones glowed with life, suggesting blood beneath skin, warmth beneath surface coolness. The transitions from light to shadow were so gradual, so subtle, that the eye could not detect where one ended and the other began. The technique called sfumato, from the Italian for smoke or vapor, a way of modeling form through infinitely soft gradations rather than through visible brushstrokes or clear boundaries. Leonardo applied this technique with particular care to Lisa's face. He wanted to capture not just her features, but something more elusive, the sense of a person thinking, feeling, existing in the moment. He paid attention to details that other painters ignored or simplified. The slight asymmetry of the face, the way one side was subtly different from the other, giving it character and individuality. The delicate modeling of the eyelids, suggesting the soft tissue and the complex musculature that allowed for expression. The mouth, painted with such subtlety that it seemed to hover between expressions, not quite smiling, not quite serious, but suggesting both possibilities simultaneously. And that smile, that famous, endlessly analyzed smile, was achieved through Leonardo's understanding of anatomy combined with his mastery of sfumato. He knew that a smile involved not just the mouth, but the entire lower face, that it changed the cheeks, created subtle lines, affected the eyes. He painted these changes with such delicacy that the smile seems to appear and disappear depending on where you focus your attention, how the light strikes the painting, even your own mood and expectations. Look directly at the mouth and the smile seems to fade. Look at the eyes and it seems to strengthen. This was not accident, but intention. Leonardo deliberately creating ambiguity, inviting interpretation, making the viewer an active participant in completing the image. The eyes, too, received Leonardo's most careful attention. He understood that eyes were not simply round objects placed in the face, but complex structures that revealed character and emotion. He painted Lisa's eyes with multiple layers of translucent glaze, building up the whites with subtle variations in tone, not pure white, but cream and ivory, with hints of reflected color from the surrounding flesh. The irises were rendered with extraordinary detail, showing the radial patterns around the pupil, the subtle variations in color and transparency. And the pupils themselves were painted as true black, creating focal points that drew the viewer's gaze, that seemed to look back with awareness and intelligence. But it was the area around the eyes that gave them life. The upper lids curved over the eyeballs with anatomical precision, their edges catching light where the skin was thin and moisture gave them slight shine. The lower lids were softer, with delicate modeling that suggested the fat pads beneath. And most remarkably, Leonardo painted the corners of the eyes with such subtlety that they seemed capable of expression, as though Lisa might at any moment shift from this serene composure into laughter or tears, as though the fixed image contained within it the potential for movement and change. He worked on the painting intermittently over many years, perhaps even decades. There is evidence that he continued refining it until very late in his life, that it traveled with him from Florence to Milan to Rome to France, that he could never quite finish it because he kept seeing things that could be improved, effects that could be enhanced, subtleties that could be pushed further. Francesco del Giocondo, who had commissioned the painting, never received it. Leonardo kept it for himself, which suggests that it had become something more than a commercial transaction, that it represented his ongoing investigation into the nature of portraiture and representation itself. During the years he worked on the Mona Lisa, Leonardo's understanding of optics, anatomy, and psychology all fed into the painting. His studies of the eye taught him how vision actually worked, how the eye perceived color and form, how peripheral vision differed from central vision. He used this knowledge to create effects that worked with the mechanics of seeing, that exploited the way the human visual system processes information. The softness of the sfumato, the ambiguity of the expression, even the strange, dreamlike landscape all were calculated to create a sense of presence and mystery that engaged viewers at a level deeper than conscious analysis. The landscape behind Lisa is one of the most enigmatic elements of the painting. It shows a wild, untamed terrain of mountains and valleys, water and rock, paths that win through impossible geology. The two sides of the landscape do not quite match. The horizon line on the left is higher than on the right, creating a subtle disorientation, a sense that this is not a real place but an imagined one, a landscape of the mind rather than of actual geography. Some scholars believe Leonardo was depicting the Tuscan countryside around Florence, others that it represents a more universal concept of nature itself, the primordial earth before human cultivation. The landscape also demonstrates Leonardo's geological knowledge, his understanding of how water shaped terrain over immense periods of time. The layers of rock, the erosion patterns, the way the river has carved its channel, all reflect his studies of natural processes, his observations of how the earth changed and evolved. But the landscape is also symbolic, suggesting the relationship between humanity and nature, between the cultivated figure in the foreground and the wild, timeless processes of the natural world extending infinitely behind her. Lisa sits between civilization and wilderness, between the human realm of thought and culture and the vast, indifferent forces that preceded human existence and will continue after it ends. Leonardo paid equal attention to Lisa's clothing and the chair she sits in, though these elements are subordinate to the face and hands. She wears a dark dress with a low neckline, a style typical of wealthy Florentine women of the period. Over this is a light veil, painted so delicately that it seems almost invisible, a gauzy layer that softens without concealing. The fabric of the dress falls in folds that demonstrate Leonardo's understanding of drapery. The way weight and structure determine how cloth behaves. He had studied this for decades, creating elaborate drapery studies on paper, and in the Mona Lisa, this knowledge translated into cloth that looks absolutely convincing, that you could almost reach out and touch. Her hands, folded in the foreground, are painted with the same meticulous care as her face. Leonardo understood that hands revealed character as much as faces did. The way someone held their hands, the shape of the fingers, the texture of the skin, all conveyed information about age, personality, social status. Lisa's hands are soft, well cared for, the hands of someone who did not perform manual labor. They are positioned with elegant simplicity, the right hand resting over the left, creating a diagonal line that leads the eye into the composition. The fingers are slightly curved, relaxed, but not limp, suggesting a person at ease with herself and with the viewer. But there is also something mysterious about the hands. They are painted with absolute realism, yet they seem almost too perfect, too idealized. Some scholars have suggested that Leonardo idealized Lisa's hands, just as he may have idealized aspects of her face. That he was painting not just what he saw, but what he believed represented the essence of feminine grace and composure. Others argue that the hands are painted exactly as they were, that any sense of idealization comes from Leonardo's technical mastery, making reality appear more perfect than we expect reality to be. As the years passed and Leonardo continued working on the painting, it became his companion, his meditation, perhaps even his obsession. While other artists produced dozens of portraits, Leonardo poured his entire philosophy of painting into this single image. Every technique he had developed, every insight he had gained about light and color and human perception, every piece of anatomical knowledge he had acquired through dissection, all of it went into the Mona Lisa. The painting became a summation of his art, a demonstration of everything painting could achieve when practiced at the highest level. There is a story, recorded by Giorgio Vasari in his Lives of the Artists, that while Leonardo was painting Lisa, he employed musicians and jesters to keep her entertained, to maintain that subtle expression of contentment and gentle amusement. Whether this is literally true or merely a legend designed to explain the famous smile, it reveals something about how Leonardo approached portraiture. He understood that a person's expression was not fixed but fluid, that catching the right moment required not just technical skill, but psychological insight, an ability to see past the formal pose into the person beneath. He wanted Lisa relaxed, natural, herself, rather than performing the role of portrait subject. And somehow, through patience and attention, and his own peculiar genius, he achieved it. The painting accumulated layers not just of paint, but of time itself. Each layer represented weeks or months of work, periods when Leonardo focused intensely on the portrait, alternating with periods when he set it aside to work on other projects. The Mona Lisa became a record of Leonardo's evolving technique, his changing understanding, his ongoing refinement of effects he had been pursuing throughout his career. The deepest layers, laid down first, contained the foundation, the drawing, the basic composition, the establishing of values. The middle layers built up form and color, creating the illusion of three-dimensional space and solid bodies existing within it. And the final layers, applied perhaps years after he began, were the delicate touches that created mystery and depth, the infinitely subtle gradations that made the painting seem alive. Modern scientific analysis using infrared reflectography and other imaging techniques has revealed some of Leonardo's working process. Beneath the visible surface lie earlier versions, changes and adjustments that show him refining his vision. Lisa's hands were originally positioned differently,